Well, this is, folks, the end of line, the last Crossed series that you have been requesting us to cover for quite some time now. Wish you were here. The series follows a group of survivors that have holed up on the small island of Cara in Scotland. They try their best to keep some semblance of the society they remember while battling their own struggles. This band of survivors had managed to find a safe haven for themselves right after the outbreak and well before the birth of the smart Crossed. But will they survive for the coming decades? Let's find out. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 1, Issue Number 1, Running. We start with the introduction of our protagonist, Shaky. He is writing the first page of his blank notebook and tells the reader that most people living and surviving after the outbreak have seen horrific things. Sooner or later, they come to terms with the fact that violation and terrifying sights are now a part of their ecosystem. But then one day, a Crossed will do something so surprising and horrific that their knees will buckle again. This is what has happened right now, and this knee buckling experience has prompted Shaky to begin his journal. We see him writing his journal under the dim light of a candle while sitting in a hammock at night. But the horrific sight he is talking about happened that morning when he was on the lookout duty. We see Shaky high up in a shoddy watchtower, likely constructed by the survivors after the outbreak. He checks out the shoreline of Hoy Island through his binoculars when we hear him exclaim loudly. Something has caught his eye, and whatever it is has sent chills down Shaky's spine. We are then shown what made Shaky swear under his breath. It is a Crossed on the Hoy Island beach, violating the blowhole of a dolphin while stabbing it again and again. Shaky is clearly disgusted by the sight as he removes the binoculars and contemplates his choices. As we continue reading his journal, Shaky tells us that one would think that ringing the bells would have been the best choice once he had spotted the Crossed. After all, that's what he was there for. It was his duty, the lookout duty. He then tells us that they community even had a ton of people and sheep out in the open. People gardening, relaxing on rocks, fishing out in the sea. But then Shaky tells us that although it might seem like the right choice, killing a Crossed and creating panic was always a last resort. Noise, commotion, gunshots, everything could spell a lot of trouble in these dark times, which is why Shaky waited and kept a close eye on the Crossed instead. Because even if small, there was the slightest chance that the Crossed wouldn't notice their paradise and simply move on. He then tells us that even on that day, Shaky was struggling with writer's block. He had plenty of time since the community was established to write his journal, yet he had failed to find a starting point for it that seemed right in his mind. We then see him try to have his lunch and then get disheartened again because it's fish, one of the few sources of sustenance that is plenty around their island, but something Shaky has grown to detest after having it regularly. He then decides to check on the Crossed again, and his worst nightmare comes true. The Crossed had grown tired of violating the dolphin, and something out on the sea had caught his eye, and when Shaky notices this, he instantly throws his lunch away, knowing full well that the time for last resort has finally arrived. Surprisingly, the Crossed has a boat at his hands, and he is furiously shoving it into the water and heading towards a lone, straggling boat between Hoy and Cara. We then see Shaky alert the settlement using 2 bells. It seems the survivors have a system in place to alert the settlement about approaching threats. There are 2 bells, a big one under the label Tigers and a small one under the label Hours, and as Shaky uses them, we understand how the bells are meant to be used. The big bell labelled Tigers is for the number of Crossed approaching the island, and in this case, Shaky rings it once because it's a lone straggler. He then rings the small bell labelled Hours 9 times, and the Hours bell seems to signify the direction the attack is coming from. It represents the hours on an analog clock. In this case, the Crossed is coming from 9 o'clock, which is westward of Hoy. As Shaky rings the bell, we see that the survivors aren't surprised by the direction. They seem to have faced most of their attacks from this direction. We are then shown a map of Cara Island and its surroundings. It's clear why this direction has been the bane of their existence since they settled on Cara. It's the closest point from the mainland where Cara Island can be seen. The rest of Hoy is either too far or blocked off by smaller islets. We then see why the Crossed rushed out into the sea. The small boat we saw in the distance earlier is one of the survivors, fishing out in the sea, quite a way out from Cara. Shaky's journal entries tell us that he was expecting the worst when he realised the situation. He never expected the Crossed to be this fast, never expected him to have a boat, and never, ever expected him to paddle in the direction of the survivor fishing on the boat so fast like an adept sailor. Shaky then melancholily writes that these days, imagination is just a waste of brain brain space because daydreamers don't survive this world. We then see him pick up his gun while spitting out obscenities under his breath, and we are then shown the survivor on the boat that is in danger. He is lost in his thoughts, completely unaware of the Crossed approaching him at breakneck speed. Shaky's journal entries then tell us that he did not care for the kid on the boat that much because he had never cared for him since his arrival at the settlement. He was a survivor from Liverpool and was brought here by the last team of survivors that went out for supplies in Thurso. Shaky tells us that the kid was named Vincent, and although he never made small talk with Vincent, he always chided him repeatedly for straying out too far and for wearing a thick hat that covered his ears and impeded his hearing, all of which was now coming into play. We then see Vincent completely lost in his thoughts and unable to hear the survivors from the shore screaming for him. The sound of the Crossed nearby makes him snap out of his dreams, but by that time, it's already too late. Vincent tries to reach for the paddle while the Crossed beelines towards him. We then see Shaky already aiming down the sights of his rifle, while a woman climbs the lookout tower while screaming for him to take the shot. She then screams over his shoulder again, and Shaky then tells us that he is waiting for the Crossed to come in range. Sweat pours down his face as Shaky finally pulls the trigger. Bang! It's a miss, and the shot only manages to take out the Crossed's left ear. Shaky falls to the floor as the woman takes the gun from his hands and shoots again. This is when Shaky's journal entry reads, "Before you ask, no, I am not named Shaky for missing my shots." By now, the Crossed has managed to capsize both his and Vincent's boat. He has already leapt onto Vincent, but before he can do any damage, a bullet comes whizzing through the air and blows his brains out. Shaky is looking down his binoculars, confirming the kill to the woman while she is busy muttering under her breath, "Don't swallow the water, don't swallow the water." Vincent is a smart kid. He has climbed onto a capsized boat and is giving a thumbs up to everyone on the shore while voluntarily puking his guts out. We then see one of the men, who the survivors call Chief, order the other survivors to send a boat to Vincent with new paddles. However, that is when the orders are interrupted by more bells from the lighthouse, the second structure that is charged to keep a lookout. 6 more Crossed are coming from the same direction, and when the chief looks towards the watchtower for confirmation, they see the woman and Shaky frantically flailing their arms to confirm the same. We then see the Crossed rush out from the tree line and directly into the sea. These ones are armed, clothed, and this is when Shaky's journal entries and the chief's demeanour take a drastic turn. Shaky's journal entry says that there are 2 types of running in this world, and the only thing these 2 types have in common is the fact that they don't last. In contrast to this, we see the chief order his men to break out the weapons and keep a boat on standby, just in case Vincent manages to survive this. But his men don't share his optimism. They have already marked Vincent as a dead man in their books, and when the chief looks out into the sea, he can't help but change his opinion, because Vincent made the stupid choice of ditching the boat and swimming towards the shore instead. Meanwhile, 3 Crossed are correcting one of the overturned boats, while the other 3 are chasing after Vincent. This scene is juxtaposed by Shaky's journal entry that says the first type of running is running from something or someone. This kind of running ends when you are caught. He tells us that getting caught is a given in this new world. Sooner or later, everybody gets caught. And this sentence is juxtaposed by Vincent getting caught by the survivors. He is hauled into the boat they uprighted, and they waste no time in showing Vincent what hell looks like. One of them stabs his leg while the others get busy violating him. Shaky falls to his knees, and the woman simply climbs down from the watchtower. The Crossed are now using the boat to make their way to the Cara Island, and this scene is juxtaposed by Shaky's other journal entry that discusses the second type of running, which is running to something or somewhere. He tells us that running to is quite rare, especially running somewhere or someplace, because travelling distances is quite dangerous, and making sure that the journey is worth it is the worst kind of gamble. He doesn't know of another settlement in the world that has managed to survive like ones they have built on Cara Island. We then see the survivors breaking out their stored weapons. The next page shows us the survivors making their stand and taking out the Crossed with utmost precision. As the Crossed are killed, Shaky's journal entries hint at the fact that he doesn't have much hope for their settlement. Even though they have a decent society and a steady food supply, for some reason, Shaky thinks this peace won't last. We then see that 3 of the Crossed have survived their wounds, and the survivors survivors have decided not to waste any more bullets. The woman that was with Shaky on the watchtower is now making a Molotov cocktail, while 2 other survivors from the settlement pour oil down into a pipeline. One of the crossed stares into the water at the shoreline as it gets darker around them, while the other 2 rush to the shore. This is when the Molotov cocktail is flung into the ocean by the woman we saw earlier, and this entire sequence is juxtaposed by Shaky's journal entry that makes it clear as to why he has no hopes for this settlement. He tells us that he sees the settlement as a sickness, a temporary aberration. He thinks this is a communal tantrum by 24 survivors that are too tired, scared, or angry to keep moving on while pretending to protect the supposed lives they have on this island. We then see the entire patch of the sea where the Crossed were go up in flames. The Crossed are burned to a crisp in an instant as Shaky watches all of this unfold from the watchtower while keeping an eye out for any more attacks. He then reveals why he's called Shaky. It's short for Shakespeare, and that's because Shaky used to be a writer before the outbreak. We then see why Shaky was still on his toes in the watchtower. It's because he was waiting for the turned Vincent to make his move. We then see the crossed Vincent make his way to the shore with an amputated arm, but before he can take his first few steps, he is shot in the head by Shaky. Shaky slumps down onto his stool on the watchtower as his journal entries tell us that he too used to be a daydreamer. He was paid to daydream, but now daydreamers don't last, just like Vincent. He has had to face this harsh reality while making sure he survives this world. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Vol 1, Issue Number 2, Lucky Lucky Boy. This issue introduces us to life on Cara, how the islanders operate, and how everyone, including Shaky, has been relying on luck for survival, even though they've grown to hate that part of their lives. This is why we will be skimming through this issue to get back to the story at hand. This comic begins with Shaky's second entry in the journal. He is woken up by loud snoring in the middle of the night, and we see him pull his privacy sheets apart to confirm what he already knew. It was Don. Don was one of the leaders of the settlement, and his snoring and Shaky's disdain for him is juxtaposed by the journal entry, where Shaky tells us that despite the 24 people on the island, none of them bothered to keep check of the calendar since they got here. Because why bother? An eternal question that ruled their lives on the island. He then leaves his quarters and tells us how they live on the island, and the comic shows us a detailed map. He is heading into the lighthouse as Shaky tells us that the island's tip is a peninsula. It is called the Calf of Cara. It is cut off from the rest of the island by water, and the tip is where the lighthouse is. Their sleeping quarters are in this region, and the tip has cliff faces on all 3 sides. The side that connects to the island is rigged with noise traps and razor wire. The survivors travel back to the Calf of Cara each night and sleep with no light sources. The rest of the island is where they go daily to grow vegetables and catch fish from the beaches. Seals occupy the south of the island, while pipes have been buried on each beach in case of an attack like we saw earlier. There is a watchtower in the middle of the island, and the survivors always have 2 people on lookout duty. During the day, one is on the watchtower and one in the lighthouse, and at night, both people keep an eye out from the lighthouse. We then see Shaky reach the lighthouse and join the 2 people on lookout duty for the night. The 2 of them are focused on a boat passing by, as Shaky tells us how he survived the middle of London when the outbreak began. The gist of it is that he was always lucky, too lucky for his own good. It is how he landed the job of a writer and avoided the 9-to-5 routine, and it was luck that allowed him to escape London. There was always someone else the Crossed focused their attention on, always another Crossed seeking to kill the Crossed hunting him. He simply got lucky, and so did the islanders. That's why they have been able to survive on this island this long, even though they have done their best to eradicate luck from the equation. At moments like tonight, many of them hope that they weren't this lucky, because being lucky is boring. Being saved from the Crossed again and again while being isolated on an island can be boring. We then see the boat full of the Crossed ignore the island, and the man keeping an eye on them through the night vision scope put it down dejectedly. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 1, Issue Number 3, Isolated Politics and Compromises. The first page of this panel shows us an argument between the 2 leaders of Cara, and Shaky's journal entries introduce us to these leaders, Don and Rab. Don is the pot-bellied man with a pompous English accent, while Rab is rough and tough-weathered old man with a huge beard and Scottish accent. The argument is an age-old one. Don wants to send out a party to nearby towns to gather supplies, while Rab thinks there's no point risking all their lives. This argument continues, and Shaky tells us that this is a regular occurrence on the island every few months. The argument is halted when a middle-aged woman from the island comes to fetch everyone in the meeting area because something odd has been spotted on the horizon. When they reach outside, they all are shocked to see a tortured cow propped in a drowning dinghy. The cow is barely alive, and its screams resemble the cries from hell. Shaky and Elisa are using their rifles to take a closer look, while another argument has sprouted between Don and Rab. Rab wants to use the cow for meat or put it out of its misery. Don says that they shouldn't mess with things because he suspects a Crost is on the boat and that this is a trap. Shaky, meanwhile, has been trying to tell them that there is something in the cow's rear, but both of them are busy arguing. When the argument reaches a stalemate, Rab picks up a rock and throws it at the cow, and that is when all hell breaks loose. When the stone hits the cow, the entire contraption collapses, and Shaky finally spots what was hidden in the cow's rear. It was a rigged grenade, and it blows up the entire thing the very next second. As the two leaders realize this was a trap, they quickly compromise and decide to send out a sortie. The plan is to source guns, ammo, and other supplies. Whether this trap was set up by the Crost or other nearby survivors, they needed to be prepared. Crost Wish You Were Here, Volume 1, Issue Number 4, Catharsis. This comic introduces us to another food source for the islanders, rabbit. It also introduces us to the man who was using the night vision scope the day they spotted the Crost in the dinghy. His name is Des, and currently Shaky, Des, and Elisa are on the nearby Farah Island to check the traps the islanders have set. They carry out the mission as if it were a military invasion. They are covered from head to toe in gear and armed with rifles. Shaky takes it a little less seriously, but Elisa is totally invested in it. Shaky's journal entries tell us that the air was heavy with silence today, as though everyone was waiting for something to happen, and all they had to look forward to was the upcoming sortie. Shaky tries to make small talk with Elisa by asking if she would volunteer, but she tells him that she is undecided, and then tells him to shut up and stop asking questions. They find rabbits in their traps, and Shaky tells us that they let the rabbits breed here because they ran out of the rabbits on Carver long ago. He has stopped being careful because the mission has been quite eventful, but that is when he is pulled down to the ground by Elisa, who has just spotted a live Crost. Shaky tells us that he has always found Elisa to be too hard on herself and the people around her, but she has her perks that can come handy, especially at moments like these, because it was her idea to poison old bodies in case any of the Crost came around, and it is the reason why this Crost old woman is currently struggling to move. But when they take a closer look, her death is quite mysterious. A Crost old man is lying dead beside her, and the entire area is covered in dead birds. What's more puzzling is the fact that the woman's hands and one leg have been amputated. But who amputated them? And who led her to this island? And if someone amputated her, then why didn't they amputate the old man? This is when Des steps into action and proceeds to end the woman's misery. Shaky introduces us to him and tells us that Des has a kid on the island. Nobody knows what happened to his wife, and nobody has dared to ask. Des raises his machete to the deed, but he is stopped by Elisa, who seems visibly shaken. Turns out, the old woman has the same hair as Elisa's mother. Elisa falls to her knees as she stares at the unmoving Crost woman. Shaky sends Des away to check on the rest of the traps while he consoles Elisa. When Des is gone, Shaky takes a moment to ponder the scene in front of him, and in his journal, he writes that when a strong woman is holding herself back from crying, it really hits you hard. He approaches her, and with tears streaming down her face, Elisa tells her story to him. Her mother had a stroke when she was a kid. They didn't have enough money to afford a carer for her, and so she had to do everything for her mother from the age of 9 to 30. Shaky places his hand on her shoulder as Elisa tells him that her mother was her world. They would play games, talk at length, everything they could do to pass the time. She tells him that for her, the worst part is that her mother died a day before the outbreak, and so Elisa never even got 24 hours to experience the world the way it was. However, Shaky fails to see her perspective and thinks that she loved her mother. He offers to kill the Crost woman, but Elisa says that she will do it herself. It will be cathartic for her. Shaky decides to leave her alone and then goes and joins Des. The two of them go to check on the next trap, but what they find again horrifies them and adds to the latest string of mysterious events. They now realise what happened to the old woman's hands. The rabbit in the next trap is decapitated, and where the head should be is the Crost woman's amputated hand. holding up 2 fingers. Shaky has barely taken this in when he hears Eliza's scream. The 2 men rush back to her, only to find a raging Eliza smashing in the old woman's head with the butt of her gun. While doing this, Eliza is screaming, "Bitch! You old bitch! You wasted my life 20 years! Waiting for you to die! Look what you left for me! Look at it!" Shaky and Des grab her and carry her back to the boat, knowing full well what Eliza is going through. Des takes charge of the navigation, while Shaky lets Elisa take a much-needed nap on the way back. As she is sleeping, he washes the crossed blood from her gun in the sea, and at night, he writes in his journal that thicker silences often culminate this way on the island, with everyone confronting things they'd rather not. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 1, Issue Number 5, Mysteries. This new comic is another new journal entry from Shaky, and a frustrated one. He's frustrated because it's a full moon night with 0 clouds, which means they can't use the kitchen because the smoke will be visible for miles. This also means that the delicious rabbit meat is going to waste. What's more frustrating to him is that the islanders are talking about mysteries, something he avoids at all costs because they only waste time. And what's more is that some mysteries shouldn't be solved in a world like this. He leaves the conversation, sits on the shores nearby, and begins to journal. As he journals, we see he doesn't remember much about his past. His brain was working on autopilot after his escape from the cafe, and Shaky had passed out in a destroyed house for the night. Upon waking up, he had tried contacting his loved ones, and then once again, his body had begun operating on autopilot. To this day, he has no idea how he got to the St. Paul's Cathedral, because that's when he snapped out of his daze. He was once again attacked by a crossed, and in his attempt to escape, Shaky never looked where he was running to, a mistake he hadn't committed since. This mistake caused him to stumble into the London Underground station, which was covered in red, and this sight had traumatized him for life. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 1, Issue Number 6, The Answer to Mysteries. This comic shows us the horrid scene inside the underground where Shaky landed. To quote Shaky, "It was an orgy of violence," and that it was, and all he did in response was hide in the corner near the stairs. He had simply waited till the crossed were distracted by the sound of gunshots on the street above. Guns were rare in the UK, and Shaky remembers that the crossed somehow retained this fact. It was why all of them had rushed towards the sound. Shaky had used this chance to make his escape, and had then done the unthinkable. Unable to bear the weight of what was happening around him, Shaky had jumped off of the Millennium Bridge in an attempt to kill himself. The sheer memory of drowning in the Thames forces Shaky to puke his guts out in the present day. He gathers himself and goes back to journaling, but that is when he spots a mysterious light from the island on the other side of the water, momentarily before it quickly vanishes. But instead of raising the alarm or informing the others, Shaky simply grins and scribbles the following in his journal: "Mysteries, mysteries, mysteries. Ignore, ignore, ignore." Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 1, Issue Number 7, Some Days Are Just About Sex. The story and Shaky's 6th journal entry begin by telling us of the day he was helping around the island by dyeing sheep green in colour. This apparently makes them difficult to be spotted from long distances. This comic also introduces us to the Masouds, an Islamic family on the island that keeps its distance from the rest of them. They are polite enough, which is why the islanders don't mind them. That day, 15-year-old Roshan Masood expressed an interest in Shaky and offered to be intimate with him. This had made Shaky lose control over the ram he was supposed to hold, which had resulted in the ram humping him in front of everyone. This had forced Mr. Masood to save Shaky, giving Roshan enough time to offer the proposition to someone else. At Mrs. Masood's request, Shaky went looking for Roshan and found her intimate with an ex-soldier from the island named John. He had coughed loudly to alert them of his presence, which forced them to wrap things up quickly. However, when Shaky got back, he realised that Mr. Masood was frantically searching for his daughter and had failed to keep a close eye on his 3-year-old son. Sadly, baby Masood was playing near a nest of carrion crows. This species is known to bring gifts from far away to their mates, and by the time Shaky and Mr. Masood reached the baby, it was already too late. The crows had brought pieces of human flesh, and baby Masood was currently playing with a severed eyeball. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 1, Issue number 8, What is Fair After All. This is the 7th entry in the journal, and it starts with Shaky telling us that this day was one of those days where you don't want to do anything or care about anything. We see him sulking atop the lighthouse when Elisa comes to summon him for the meeting of core council members. Mr. Masood will address them and discuss matters with them during the meeting. However, Shaky simply has a baby tantrum and says that he doesn't want to attend the meeting. Elisa leaves, and the next page shows us Roshan's little brother trapped in a cage while being observed and studied by the islanders. Don is proposing to use this as an opportunity to study the Crossed and to learn from it. They can learn about their weakness, behavioural patterns, and maybe even discover a cure. This mention of a cure makes Shaky visibly get angry. He screams at the top of his lungs as he says, "What the fuck is wrong with you? How many times do we have to go over this? This isn't Hollywood. There isn't a bloody kryptonite, people. There's no fucking fight back. No secret bastions of civilizations. There is no cure." Elisa knows Shaky's on thin ground, and so she adds to the conversation by saying that the baby has a family. He is no brat. The islanders can't simply go around experimenting on him. Shaky appreciates the help and knows that he owes her big time. They all then take another look at the Masoods. They are barely surviving knowing that they've lost a child. Mrs. Masood is crying on the side with Roshan in her arms, while Mr. Masood is simply sitting with his hands on his knees, staring at the islanders and his crossed child. John tries to continue the conversation by siding with John. He says that they can learn about the Crossed and use it on the upcoming sortie, and this is when Shaky angrily tells John to fuck off. John confronts Shaky, and this gives Shaky a chance to reveal his secret. He blames John for sleeping with Roshan, which in turn forced her parents to leave the baby and go look for her. Shaky journals that he knew at that moment that this was a low blow, but also accepts that he liked saying that to John's face. However, when you look at Shaky's face at this moment, he looks like a maniac with a huge smile on his face. John is unable to answer or say anything, and before anyone else can join in on the confrontation, they see Mr. Masood walking up to John. He walks up and simply demands John's gloves and helmet. He then turns towards his crossed child and politely asks everyone to leave the area. Shaky's journal entry tells us that they all left at his request, and that was the last they saw of the baby. There were no shouts, screams, or even tears. This is when we realise that the first scene we saw of Shaking on top of the lighthouse was the present day, and he has been here since Mr. Masood asked them to leave him with the baby. He hears shouts coming from the meeting, and so reluctantly, he decides to climb down and join in on the conversation. Mr. Masood is volunteering for the sortie despite his wife's cries against this decision. This is when Don and Rab look at each other and reveal to the islanders that they won't be taking volunteers for the sortie anymore. The people that get to go on the sortie will be picked through a lottery. This is the fairest way according to the two leaders. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 1, Issue number 9. Everything escalates within its natural limits. This comic continues the 7th entry of the diary, where Shaky tells us about his concept of everything escalating within its natural limits. You can have terrifying nightmares about monstrous animals, but even those dreams will still be limited by their natural limits. After this introduction, we see Shaky wake up in the morning, hear crossed voices, and quickly rush up to the top of the lighthouse. There he meets up with the two islanders that are tonight's lookouts. They haven't rung the bells yet because the sight of the seals in the night attracted them here, and although they are a few hundred feet away from the island, the area that they are in is quite dangerous. It is two crossed men who are busy fighting a couple of seals. When Shaky takes a closer look, he smiles because in the scupper flow. It isn't dangerous as long as you're on the surface, but if you go under the water, the currents are quite treacherous and can drag you into the ocean depths within seconds. Shaky watches the crossed make quick work of the seals, and when they hear another one nearby, the bald crossed jumps into the water to head to its location. Sadly, he gets caught in the currents and is quickly dragged down. The hairy crossed jumps on the shore, and Shaky and the islanders figure that he might have been smart enough to wait and see his friend's fate, or just didn't know how to swim. When Shaky sees the crossed drowning, he is horrified because that is exactly the way he tried to kill himself when all of this started. As he is reminded of this, we are shown a flashback of what happened while Shaky was in the water. The boat had saved him, and it belonged to the police. A hardy sergeant and his support manned the boat, a younger woman with a lot of skill. They were still getting familiar with the Crossed, which is why the sergeant was itching for a fight. He didn't care that Shaky had tried to kill himself because he thought everyone had turned. All he cared about was saving him. We then see that another police officer is currently struggling with hypothermia on the floor, and his support, the young woman named Stace, is keeping tabs on him. When she tells the sergeant that they will need a proper medic to bring the man up to health, their prayers are answered in the form of army soldiers swarming the city of London before their eyes. The sergeant rejoices as the army fights against the Crossed, but in hindsight, Shaky's journal entries tell us that because the army knew nothing about the Crossed, they were doomed from the moment they attacked. Because the army still saw the Crossed as infected citizens that could have been saved in the future, they shot them in the legs and arms but never the head. And this was a mistake, because the Crossed enjoyed this pain, and slowly but surely they reached the front lines. And once they reached there, they began infecting soldiers using their bodily fluids. In this flashback, we're shown a Crossed spitting in a soldier's face, and moments later, the soldier has turned. Crossed, Wish You Were Here, Volume 1, Issue number 10, You Conform with Time. The stranded Crossed has now lost his voice by the next day. Shaky and the kids from the island are using this as entertainment and taunting the Crossed from the shore. Shaky remembers how this is exactly like the sergeant who saved him. He was taunting the Crossed until Stace had realised that men from the army who had been infected were about to come for them. She had instantly commandeered the boat and had made a run for it, but the Crossed soldiers on the land had fired a shell at them from a tank. The explosion narrowly missed them by a few feet, and amidst this chaos, the sick crewmate of Stace and Sergeant had stirred back to life. He was infected and had now turned into the Crossed. He had lunged for Shaky, but Stace saved his life in the nick of time. However, because no one was steering the boat, it lurched sideways the very next second, sending both her and the infected crewmate into the water. Shaky was horrified when he watched the Crossed eating Stace's face, but he had no time to feel remorseful because the Crossed on the other boat had just fired a rocket at them. Shaky had narrowly managed to escape the explosion by jumping into the water, and he recounts that Stace and the sergeant were the two people that saved his life without asking anything in exchange. Because as time has passed, everyone in the world has become more and more selfish. They all have conformed with Te. We then catch up with Shaky in the present day, who is once again awakened by Don's snoring and intrigued by new Crossed voices from the shore. It's nothing to worry about though. New infecteds have shown up to make the hairy one's life a living hell, and Shaky joins the lookout party to enjoy their new form of entertainment in this world. Crossed, Wish You Were Here, Volume 1, Issue number 11, The Downside of Volunteers. This comic begins Shaky's 8th journal entry, and it's clear that he and the rest of the islanders are struggling with boredom, their mundane routine of working on Carver, and then retreating to the northern tip at night. Putting up the same defences and the same razor wire is getting to them. Shaky tells us that although he shouldn't do it, he finds himself wishing for an encounter every now and then just to get a break from the monotony. We then see him having a heated argument with Don about his fascist ways and how he is forcing the lottery on everyone without any public vote. The argument, however, is interrupted when they hear bells from the watchtower on the main island. This is odd because no one is supposed to be posted there, and that is when everyone realises that the last man on the job forgot to muffle the bells. Lance, the son of Skip and Jackie, was the last lookout, and he is currently refusing to accept his mistake and is acting entitled. Shaky tells us that Lance's bad attitude is partly due to his parents being on the inner council and partly because he is a teenager. We then see Don tell the rest of them that Lance will have to take responsibility for his actions and muffle the bells on his own. A cacophony of protests erupt immediately, and most islanders aren't happy with this decision. Skip volunteers to fix his son's mistake, and so do Des, John and Mr. Masood. They all argue, but in the end John ends the conversation by saying that he should be the one going because the rest of them all have families. This moment of self-sacrifice forces Roshan to reveal their relationship to everyone, and she ends up kissing John on the lips. Shaky uses this moment of distraction to whisper his offer to volunteer under his breath so that he doesn't feel left out, and so John ventures out into the island in the middle of the night, and at first things go according to plan. The bells stop ringing and they all see John coming back. But then it happens. Gunshots. Not one, not two, but all 6 of them. Elisa and her fire team get ready and take position as we see John being chased by 6 Crossed that have somehow found the island. Unfortunately, Elisa and her team can't fire until they get within range. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 1, Issue number 12, Hard Truths. We pick up where we left off. After John leaps into the razor wire, it is no wonder he is tangled up in it. Thankfully, he hasn't been infected yet, and Elisa has picked up her rifle after looking at the Crossed chasing him. Rab is encouraging John to stay calm and make his way through, but John panics and gets caught in the wire every now and then. He manages to reach halfway through, but is too tangled to move further. The razor wire even scratches his face, but John isn't worried about it. He is panicking too much. Skip and Des run into the field to help him while Shaky gives the word that the Crossed are in range. The fire team begins firing and the Crossed are shot as they get closer. The situation is dire and Shaky has joined the effort to get John free while Des covers them using his gun. He continues shooting as many Crossed as he can, but they are inching closer with every shot and they can't risk getting in range of the splatter. Only John's foot remains caught in the razor wire, but by now it's too late. Des has been forced to retreat, and Shaky too is running away. It is only Skip who is trying to untie John, but when one of the Crossed manages to pee on John's foot, it's all over. Angrily, Don screams for the 3 of them to retreat and leave John behind. Skip doesn't want to do it, but Shaky just saw it happen. He convinces Des and Skip to leave John. The 3 men walk away from their friend as John screams for them to help him, screaming that the piss didn't touch him, screaming that his clothing has saved him. Rab orders the fire team to shoot him to put him out of his misery, but Elisa and the rest deny that request vehemently. Don then jumps into action, takes Lance's knife and throws it towards John. The Crossed have reached John by now, and they are taking off his pants. He knows the only choice he has, and so before he can be violated by the Crossed, John takes the knife and slices his own throat. They all stand there in silence, as Don confidently takes credit for his quick thinking and says that he avoided all of them the guilt of killing John. They all stare at him momentarily, and the fire team continues shooting the Crossed. They shoot everyone, including John this time, and when Don tries to walk away from the incident nonchalantly, Shaky screams at him to show some respect. This is when Don turns around seething with anger and screams, "Fuck you, Shakespeare! Fuck all of you! This is what you get. This is what happens when people volunteer. The useful ones step up and they fucking die." He then points at Lance and continues his rant by saying, "And what's left is the pointless shit that wasn't worth saving in the first place." As Don walks away, he reveals the main reason for the lottery too. It's because of this. They don't want useful people with skills to volunteer and get killed. This is why the lottery is fair. Des calls this entire thing unfair, and Skip tries to get Shaky to fight with Don like he always does, but Shaky says nothing. For the first time since his arrival on Carver, Shaky tells the rest of them that he agrees with Don. Don might be right this time. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 1, Issue number 13, The Requirements of Survival. This issue begins with Shaky's 9th entry into the journal, and the subject of this one is what kind of man it takes to survive in a world like this. He starts off by telling us that the mundane routine of the islanders has once again taken over, and more of them seem to be itching for an incident as each day passes after John's death. It's as though somewhere deep down inside, all of them are itching for revenge after John's death. We are then shown a glimpse of Roshan and Lance, both of whom seem to be struggling with their own flavour of remorse. Roshan is mourning John's death, while Lance regrets his irresponsibility and feels guilty about it. However, a few days later, their mundane routine was broken by the sound of the bells once again. One tiger at 9 o'clock in the direction of Hoy Island as usual. Elisa jumps into action and begins preparing the fire team, but that is when Rab eases her mind and realises that they don't need guns for this one, because he can hear a faint whisper of bagpipes over the sound of waves. Rab uses his binoculars to confirm his suspicions, and turns out he's right, it's Jackson. We are then given our first look at Jackson, a hardened Scottish man dressed in a wetsuit covered from head to toe in supplies. And this is when Shaky introduces us to him. Jackson is a capable and hardy survivor who lives independently like a nomad in the world of the Crossed. He uses bagpipes to alert the other survivors of his presence, and often visits the ones he knows for trade. Elisa, Des and Shaky go to Hoy to meet him. Shaky tells us that he suspects Rab and Jackson have some sort of history, but no one has ever bothered to ask about it. As Shaky rows the boat, boat and ponders upon the fact that Jackson survives alone, we are given a glimpse into Shaky's past and are shown what happened after the boat was blown up. He has very few memories of that time. He remembers spending days in a ditch without moving, hoping all of this would be over, but then he was forced to sneak and find his way to resources in order to survive. His most vivid memory from this time is that of having been forced to defecate in the woods, because that is when a family of the Crossed ambushed him. However, this is when Shaky is snapped out of his memory because Jackson is being approached by 3 Crossed attracted by the sound of bagpipes. But instead of running, Jackson simply takes out his machete and gun and kills them easily. By the time he is done, Shaky, Elisa and Des have reached him, and Shaky is pretty sure by now that it likely takes a crazy man to survive on his own in the world of the Crossed. We then learn the kind of crazy Jackson is. He is here to trade food, consumables, ammo, and important information in exchange for pink shoes, a sheep to satisfy his needs, and someone to pull his finger while he does that. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 1, Issue number 14, Change for the Good or Bad. The same journal entry continues in this comic, and the survivors have traded with Jackson. In exchange, he has given them 12 cans of soup, vegetables, batteries, bulbs, a gallon of gas, and a significant amount of ammo. They have agreed to his trade, but are hoping that he will forget about the shoes by morning, and if he doesn't, Maria has decided to make him a pair in the morning. As for the finger pulling, that request was denied. The core council members are gathered in the meeting shed with Jackson as he shares the important information he had promised them as a part of the trade. It turns out that Jackson has experienced the same mysterious things that the Islanders have been experiencing, albeit slightly altered encounters. He's seen smoke coming from the hills. He has seen boats full of the Crossed, large groups moving around. He has encountered weird, unidentifiable lights, someone setting traps, and someone leaving weapons behind. At first, the Islanders think Jackson is talking about some mysterious survivors, but he then tells them that he is talking about the Crossed doing all this. At times, he has even revealed his position to them just to see their reaction. But instead of attacking him or running away, they simply ignored him. Jackson then leaves because that is all the information he has to share. When the Islanders begin arguing and speculating about mysteries once again, Shaky too leaves the shed out of frustration. He then watches Jackson fighting his way through the razor wire and going towards the island. Jackson will spend the night under the moon because he doesn't want to sleep with the Islanders. As Jackson leaves, Shaky's memory begins again, and we see how he was saved back then. Luck had come into play, and a mysterious survivor had shot all of the Crossed that were ready to ambush him, all except the little girl. A loaded gun was thrown between the girl and him, and in that moment it was clear to Shaky that he was being tested. And so he did what he was supposed to, leapt for the gun and blew the Crossed girl's head off. This earned him respect, and the man leading the survivors allowed him to join their group. Back on Carver, as the rest of the Islanders go to sleep, Shaky journals into the night. This is when Shaky tells us that he knows what Don and Rab are planning. After what happened with John, he knows they won't risk losing more useful men and women who add to their society. They will likely rig the lottery, so there's a high chance Shaky's name will be pulled out for the sortie. And even though his luck usually comes to his rescue, it does so after his life has put him in precarious situations. So this time, he isn't going to risk it. He will take matters into his own hands and cheat. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 1, Issue number 15, The Beginnings of a Master Plan. This comic starts with Shaky's 10th entry in his journal. This entry doesn't have a theme, but focuses on his plan of cheating his way out of the lottery. Shaky was a writer, so he will use his skills to his advantage. He will use the age-old proven technique of deploying a femme fatale. He then lists all the possible candidates, and even speculates on how pleasure comes into play for humans in a world like this. For a moment, he feels Jackson might have it the best, because it's sheeps he loves, but he then quickly gets back on track, while shying away from how Des, Don, and the higher members of the council keep themselves satisfied. It has something to do with a girl named Sophia, but Shaky promises to get back to this topic later. He then tells us about his chosen candidate, Tabitha, a former artist who spends most of her days creating paintings and doing her chores. The two of them talk about why they create art and how they're the only two artists on the island. Tabitha makes Shaky believe that art shouldn't be created to be seen, making him rethink his ways. We then learn how Shaky got the name Shaky, the man who saved him back then, went by the name the Gamekeeper. He was ruthless when he learned that Shaky used to be a writer, a job that didn't mean anything in this world now. His skills were useless, thus they had all resorted to calling him Shakespeare and, eventually, Shaky. For the entirety of the 8 months he spent with them, Shaky never called himself a writer again. Tabitha's words make him rethink what he took away from this time, and he confesses in his journal that he is actually falling for her, but he also can't back out now. By the end of it, we see Shaky offer Tabitha her next art project, a portrait of someone he knows to appreciate art. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 1, Issue number 16, Mission Impossible, and so begins Shaky's 11th entry into his journal and his master plan to cheat his way out of the selection process. It is then revealed that Tabitha's art project was to be a portrait of Don and Rab, and Shaky would use this as a distraction. Most of the islanders were treating this as a much-needed entertainment event, giving Shaky the chance to sneak away. He then tells us more about his time with the Gamekeeper and how he was a ruthless leader who demanded loyalty. Those who didn't follow his orders died or were left behind. We are then introduced to Lloyd and Agnes Thackeray, rich kids from the British monarchy. Lloyd's father used to employ the Gamekeeper before all of this started, and Shaky tells us that initially he thought the Gamekeeper was keeping them safe out of loyalty to Lloyd's father, but he couldn't have been more wrong, because the Gamekeeper was his own shade of crazy, and Shaky had realised this when one day he had seen the Gamekeeper tower over Agnes and watch with hunger in his eyes as she relieved herself. We then return to Carver and see Shaky fiddling with the lottery box. He is using a screwdriver, but the lock refuses to budge. This is when he is ambushed by Rab, who punches him in the face. Rab had his own suspicions about Shaky, and they had just been confirmed. We then see Shaky lying in his hammock with a black eye as he concludes that leaders like Rab and the Gamekeeper can't be duped, which is why his next target will be Don. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 1, Issue number 17, The Only Upper Hand. This comic begins Shaky's 12th entry into the journal. He is among the party that is leading Jackson back to Hoy Island. Elisa and Des clearly aren't happy about him trying to cheat, and Skip is having the time of his life while calling Shaky a cheat. Shaky tries to make them realise that Don and Rab will rig the lottery, but neither of them cares. We then see what makes Skip hold power among the islanders. He owns a small yacht that he keeps in the Houston Bay. Skip keeps the engine in the lighthouse because it can be reused if anything happens to the boat, and the engine's key is always on a necklace around his neck, his most prized possession. This is when Shaky gets lost in his thoughts again and begins to see similarities between the Gamekeeper and Jackson. We are then shown the Gamekeeper leaving behind survivors who wanted to use a car. The Gamekeeper knew that cars were too loud, so most survivors had decided to part ways. Only Shaky, Thackeray's, and a man named Ashoka continued following the Gamekeeper back then, and they were right to do so, just like they were right to listen to Jackson when he had stopped them from approaching the yacht. Someone had been keeping a close eye on them. At first, Shaky and the rest are in disbelief, but their view quickly changes when they spot a recon outpost high above the bay with a well-maintained mortar aimed directly at them. What's worse is that the recon outpost is surrounded by hundreds of human corpses propped up on makeshift wooden crosses. Shaky then remembers how the Gamekeeper was right about not using cars a few miles down the highway. The survivors had crashed, and the Crossed had killed and brutalized them all. And this is when Shaky's writings in the journal tell us that the only thing the survivors can rely on in this world is the predictability of the Crossed, the predictability to be dumb and a slave to their own desires. But things might be changing after what he has spotted today in the bay alongside Jackson, Eliza, Des, and Skip. He begins to ponder the question that the Crossed might no longer be predictable because the bodies stuck to the wooden crosses have a grenade rigged in their mouths. Not only that, but they have huge X shapes carved into their faces. After spotting this horrid setup, Jackson has decided not to go out into the wild on his own for now. He has decided to stay with the islanders for a few more days out of fear, and this is the first time Shaky has seen even a hint of fear on Jackson's face. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 1, Issue number 18, Every Society Has a Currency. This begins Shaky's 14th entry into the journal and shows us that the leaders assign the islanders new jobs each morning. Elisa has been assigned to pick the vegetables while Shaky has been assigned the duty of whelking. The two quickly exchange their jobs, and this is when Shaky tells us that even their island has a currency that he might be able to use to his advantage to ensure he isn't selected for the upcoming sortie. However, However, this involves him telling us about Sophia, something he has been dreading to do. We see Sophia in nothing but a sheet over herself while counting what looks to be perfectly spherical rainbow pebbles. Shaky sighs as we see him journaling at night. He tells us that he will no longer pretend that Carver is a safe haven full of angels because he now has to reveal Sophia's story. He tells us that she only leaves the dormitory to relieve herself and to collect the pebbles that she keeps in a special box. She doesn't fish, she doesn't take watches, she doesn't do any work. And this is because her body is free to use by the men on Carver. He tells us that she is Spanish, but that is all that they know about her background. Nobody on the island understands Spanish, and what's worse is that when Maria found her in Liverpool, she was already deaf. She has no hobbies or interests, but there have been moments he has caught her looking at the kids while they play longingly. We then see that she has set up her own economy. In exchange for one of her precious pebbles, she sleeps with the men on the island. We then see Des offer her a pebble and sleep with her that night. Shaky had tried asking the women on the island how they felt about this arrangement, but none of them had given him a perspective that he didn't already have. Elisa hadn't talked to him for a week after this conversation. We then see Don offer Sophia a pebble to sleep with her. As this happens, Shaky's journal entries tell us that nobody talks about this arrangement on the island, and nobody protests. Out of his writer's urge to find answers about mysteries, about why Sophia might be doing this, he even tried talking to Tabitha about this, and all she could tell him was that Sophia was dead. She is a dead woman. It is only her body that is living, and it is slowly catching up to her death. And so he finally reveals how this economy works. Each morning hands out 3 rainbow pebbles, and the men fight for it. Jamie's gay, so he doesn't get involved. Rab's needs have always been a mystery. Mr. Masood is a married man, and he always spits on the ground whenever he sees Sophia, and Skip doesn't partake because his wife would kill him. This leaves Don, Des, and the old man who shares the quarters with Don and Shaky. John used to partake as well, but now he's dead, and so all 3 of them get a pebble each day, and the economy keeps operating. Shaky tells us that he doesn't partake in the economy because he gets easily attached. We see him have dinner and head to his quarters as he watches the old man who shares the wall with him head into Sophia's corner. He tells us there have been days he has wanted to justify Sophia's situation so that he could satisfy his need, but he simply couldn't bring himself to do so. We then see Shaky reach into his trunk and take out 6 rainbow pebbles. This is also one of the reasons he doesn't partake in the economy, because he's already rich and it is now time to cash in. We then see Shaky approach Don the next morning, and the ominous shot of Sophia watching a kid longingly and Don staring at her hungrily juxtaposes this scene. Crossed. Wish You Were Here, Volume 1, Issue number 19, When Limits Are Crossed. This begins Shaky's 15th entry in the journal, and he tells us that they are only 10 days away from the day the lottery is drawn. He has already given his share of rainbow stones to Don, and the same night he has been paid a visit by Sophia. At first, Shaky is scared that Don ratted out on Shaky, but then Sophia simply urges him to follow her. She took Shaky to the barn outside while seeming to be quite agitated, concerned and scared, all at the same time. While following Sophia there, Shaky wondered why she had decided to come to him for help. From all the people she could have chosen, why him? However, this thought is quickly pushed out of his brain when Shaky reaches the barn. One of the island's kids, ironically named Boy, is in the barn. Boy was mute, and he was found on the last sortie that had headed out a few months ago. He is barely conscious, and every minute or so he is puking his guts out again and again. At first, it seems Sophia is scared about Boy's health, but when she forces Shaky to take a closer look and smell the vomit, he realizes why she is concerned. It's because the vomit smells of fish, and there is a good chance that Boy ingested one of the fish feeding on the crossed bodies in the scupper flow. Shaky knows that this is a rare possibility because the islanders usually overcook their fish to ensure the virus doesn't get through. Still, there is the chance that the fish couldn't digest the eaten meat entirely before it was caught. Either way, he reassures Sophia that everything will be fine and promises to stay with Boy for the entire night. But that is when Sophia runs away from him as though she has seen a ghost. And Shaky knows that look too well. He is reminded of the time he had seen that look before. It was on a random night in the early days, while he was still a part of the gamekeeper's group. Like before, he had gotten up to relieve himself in the middle of the night, only to discover the gamekeeper forcing Agnes to pleasure him. Agnes's aghast look was the same look he just saw on Sophia Sophia's face. It was a look of utter horror, sadness, and a loss of dignity all mixed in one. A look that showed all the horrors one had endured in the past, and the feeling of recognition that they would have to add another horror to that pile and lock it away once more. Shaky had tried to tell Lloyd what was happening that night, but Lloyd was already awake and crying. He had simply asked Shaky to go back to sleep. Shaky tells us through his journal entries that now that he is pondering upon these incidents, he kind of finds the will to survive in some people awe-inspiring, the lengths they are willing to go to, for whatever reasons it may be. We then see Shaky catch up with Sophia in the present day, who is on the edge of the shoreline staring up at the sky. Shaky is relieved to have found her, and when he looks up at the sky to see what has grabbed Sophia's attention, he too is pleasantly surprised. It's the aurora borealis, a rare sight in these dark times. Shaky tries to make small talk with Sophia by telling her how the aurora borealis can reach this far south, but Sophia simply takes out a razor and slices her wrist. She had seen it all, experienced beauty and safety once again, while battling a renewed fear of the Crossed because she was sure that Boy was infected from the fish. Shaky hadn't done anything to help her after all. A cut like that couldn't be fixed in enough time if they were at a functional hospital right now. He had simply spent the rest of the night journaling while keeping Sophia company in her last moments. The next morning, the expected happened. Don was pissed at Shaky. He had ordered Maria to look after Boy and had then thrown the rainbow stones at Shaky's feet. It was clear that the deal was off and Shaky was again back where he had started. Square one. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 1, Issue number 20, All In or Nothing. This begins Shaky's 16th entry in the diary, and he tells us that Boy got sicker with each passing hour. Everyone pretended to care for him, and everyone pretended that they kept him in the lighthouse because it was the most comfortable there. But Shaky knew the truth. Hell, he even expected that Boy knew the truth himself. He was being kept in the lighthouse because it was the only place on the island's north side with a lockable room. Shaky was growing tired with this ignorant code the islanders lived by. The choice to ignore their heinous choices while making them boldly. Nobody even mourned Sophia, which only made Shaky hate the islanders even more. Don, Maria, Celine and Shaky were checking up on Boy and are now leaving. As Don and Celine return to their quarters, Shaky hangs around until Maria closes the door. They all think Shaky is worried about Boy. They think Shaky feels responsible for the boy because Sophia had chosen to call him in the night. And Shaky, for now, is letting their assumptions continue because he has already made up his mind. He has a plan in place and appears to be worried and sleepless because Boy is part of it. This decision to go all in and act now is something he should have done in the past, done when everything had changed under the gamekeeper's rule. A flashback then begins and shows us Primrose Place elderly and hospice residential care. According to Shaky, this was where everything had changed for him and many people of the group. This is where he wishes he would have acted like he is doing today. When the gamekeeper, Shaky, and the Thackeray's had entered the care unit, they had found the bedridden, crossed elderly people of the compound to be still alive. This was puzzling because this could only mean one thing, that they were being fed by someone who wasn't turned yet. That is the day Shaky learned that the gamekeeper was eager to find survivors, not because he was some savior or an angel, but because he was the devil. He could offer new survivors the promise of life while taking away everything else they had, their dignity, their soul, and even their supplies. We then switch back to the current day and see that Shaky has been busy journaling outside under the moonlight when he spots Celiana coming out of the barn. It turns out she is one of the watchers for the night, but Shaky offers to trade places because he has been unable to sleep. She thinks that Shaky is simply shaken by Boy being sick and allows him to take her place. As Shaky leaves, he asks her who else is keeping watch, and she tells him he should find Rab already up in the lighthouse. Shaky thanks her and the two part ways, but that is when Shaky reveals through his journal that he already knew Rab was the second lookout for the night. This has all been a part of his plan. We then see him ominously staring at the locked door when the flashback from the care facility continues. The gamekeeper had found the survivors of the care facility hiding in the basement. As this memory repeatedly plays in Shaky's head, we see him reach the top of the lighthouse and greet Rab. Rab, however, seems to be still quite angry with Shaky because the two of them barely exchange words. However, this is when Shaky's plan is revealed and everything plays out just as he had anticipated. He had opened the locked door to Boy's cabin, hoping that he would have turned by now, which he had. He was climbing up the stairs and Shaky had already spotted him. Shaky had placed Rab between him and the stairs to to ensure that Rab was attacked first, and he had planned for the morning as well. Maria could easily be blamed for forgetting to lock the door because she was quite old. The crossed boy lunges at Rab and takes him by surprise. Rab's gun falls out of his pocket, but Shaky doesn't move a muscle. There is no noise. Boy is mute, and Rab is the only one who can speak, or at least wants to, and he is currently begging for Shaky's help. Shaky picks up the gun, cocks it, and then says, "The draw, Rab, the lottery, it goes the way I want, promise it." Boy is only inches away from Rab's face and seconds away from dripping saliva onto his skin. Rab screams in agreement out of desperation, and Shaky orders him to move, then pulls the trigger. Rab jumps to the side to avoid the splatter, and Shaky blows Boy's brains out. Rab looks down at Boy's body in horror, but Shaky doesn't share the same emotion. He is cold and calculative, and as he leaves, he says, "Pleasure doing business with you, Rab." And so this is it. Shaky's plan has finally succeeded. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 1, Issue number 21, Correcting Past Mistakes. This begins Shaky's 17th entry in the journal, the first one he has titled for the reader. The title is Mysteries and Weirdness, two things he hates the most in the world. Shaky is sitting in his hammock while journaling, and his entries tell us that he doesn't care for mysterious things, at least not right now. The Islanders, however, are buzzing with enthusiasm, because today, after Lance and Jamie came back from the duty of dumping Boy's and Sophia's bodies, they revealed to everyone that they could hear gunshots and explosions coming from the Euston Bay. Shaky speculates that it could be one of the corpses on the crosses that they had seen earlier. Maybe one of their jaws had finally given out and the primed grenade finally went off on its own. Then there was another mystery. Bells were rung at noon because a boat full of the crossed was spotted. The boat missed the Islanders and passed by easily, and Shaky couldn't care less about this event either. They all simply waited on the beach, watching it disappear on the horizon, hoping that the crossed hadn't spotted the island. Jamie was sure that the Islanders had been spotted, but it seemed that the crossed had other important things at hand. This puzzled all the Islanders, all except Shaky, of course. He was dead focused on the lottery, and especially on Rab. We are then shown the flashback from the care facility, where the gamekeeper demands supplies from the survivors in the basement. The survivors are a group of old people who haven't been infected yet, and a single young nun who has been continuing her duties and caring for everyone in the facility. Shaky tells us that her name was Sister Teresa, and that she was one of the purest souls that Shaky had ever encountered in his life. Well, that is, until the gamekeeper and the rest of them had found her, of course. This was another glimpse into the human psyche for Shaky, and how humans could change their morals and personalities on a whim. The gamekeeper had tried to convince Sister Teresa to come with them, and to not waste her life and supplies on people who were already dying. He seemed sincere on the surface, but Shaky knew what the gamekeeper was planning, and he could see the hunger in his eyes. And Shaky knew that he wasn't the only one who saw that hunger. Agnes did too, and she jumped at the opportunity to convince Sister Teresa. If Teresa joined them, then it would ensure that the gamekeeper no longer abused Agnes. But Sister Teresa had stood her ground. She had refused to come with them or give up her supplies, and this had angered the gamekeeper a lot. However, this is where the flashback ends, and we are taken back to the island in the present day, where Don and Rab are holding a meeting with all the Islanders. The time for the lottery is here, and they are announcing that 4 names will be picked, and those chosen will leave the island in 2 days. Don is being awfully pompous and egotistical with this announcement. He is trying to turn it into a motivational speech, but people who have been itching to go on a sortie like Des and Jamie quickly tell him to shut up and get on with it. So Don pulls out the first name, and Tabitha is the first to be selected. She is a bit shaken, but manages to hide her emotions well. Rab pulls the next name, and it is Celine's. Unlike Tabitha, Celine is a mess. She is old and physically inept, and she knows this. She begins to cry and weep the second she realizes that she is going on a sortie while Tabitha tries to calm her. Des's impatience has, however, reached its peak, and he is already demanding for Don and Rab to get to the third name already. Don pulls out the third name, and it is one of the old men of the island named Viceroy. Someone neither of the core council members seem to even know, including Elisa. It's Rab's turn to pick the last name, and Des is continuously screaming and hoping that it's his name. Rab pulls out the slip and unfolds it. Dez's name is written on the slip, but Rab calls out Shaky's name instead of calling out Dez's name. Shaky smiles and approaches Tabitha and Celine, and this is when Shaky reveals the truth to us. His journal entries apologize to the reader because he has duped us. This was his goal from the start. He wanted to get selected for the sortie, he didn't want to escape it. As for the explanation and why he is voluntarily leaving the island, we will have to wait until his next entry. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 1, Issue number 22, Daydreamers Never Last. This is the 18th journal entry, and Shaky begins it by apologising to us, the reader, again. Shaky was afraid to write his choice down because he didn't want to face it on paper, because there was a good chance that he might end up changing it. Because this choice that he has just made, to go out on a sortie voluntarily, is making him question his sanity as well. The others are busy preparing, making lists, arguing, but Shaky is taking this time to journal and gather his thoughts. It's part of the reason why he took the lookout duty today. Another reason he is choosing to remain isolated is because his disdain for the islanders is at its peak, and he isn't sure if he'd be able to keep up the act any longer. Shaky takes a look at the islanders and sees Dez arguing with Don. Celine has agreed to trade her spot in the sortie with him, but Don vehemently denies and disapproves of this trade. Shaky reveals that he isn't suicidal, nor does he have the violent streak of Dez, who clearly isn't thinking about his daughter and what would happen to her once he's gone. Elisa too has been looking at Shaky with envy all day. Shaky then looks at Rab and tells us that the intimidation tactic with Rab worked only because Rab wants Shaky off the island too. Shaky knows that Don and Rab see him as a nuisance and the only real hurdle that stands in their way to a dictatorship, so they are more than happy to let him go off the island. Shaky says that if he had instead exchanged Rab's life for being taken off the sortie team, he would have been killed by him a long time ago. Shaky's thoughts are then interrupted by Roshan, who is here to tell him that the islanders have prepared a farewell meal for the party. She also tells him that Jackson will accompany them until Thurso, which should be a bit comforting. But before Shaky can give Roshan a proper response, he spots a boat on the horizon. A boat of 3 crossed, led by a nun. The boat seems quite articulate, contrary to what the crossed are believed to be capable of. The bones have been articulately placed to form a cross at the front, and the nun is currently handing an amputated leg to one of the crossed. The crossed then proceeds to violate the nun with the amputated leg, but when he fails to meet her desires, she does it herself. This grotesque act sends shivers down Shaky's spine, and it is only when Roshan calls out to him again that Shaky can center himself. He picks up his rifle and aims, remembering the moment the gamekeeper looked at Sister Teresa angrily. It was one of the nastiest things Shaky had taken part in, and it still haunts him. And for once in Shaky's life, it seems his luck has run out. And he feels the same way, because when he looks down the scope, he spots the crossed Sister Teresa looking right back at him. Roshan sees the terror in his eyes and asks him about it, but Shaky doesn't tell her anything. He keeps it all to himself. The crossed have ignored the island, and he has decided not to share this event with anyone. In his journal, however, he writes that he knows one thing is for sure: he will die if he stays on Carver any longer, because he is being driven by the new mysteries that keep presenting themselves. Mysteries he isn't supposed to think about, haunted by all the free time he has to himself, which makes him overthink, and their mundane routine and the same small talk, a vicious and endless cycle. We see that the farewell dinner is uneventful, and Shaky looks miserable throughout the entire process. The islanders think it's because he has to go out in the world, but we now know why he looks miserable. It's because he is still here on the island. Mrs. Masood, Lance and Skip wish him well on the journey ahead. The last page shows Shaky looking longingly at the horizon. All the others look miserable as they say their goodbyes, but Shaky is focused on the horizon, and he looks more determined than ever. He then writes these final words in the journal. It's my own lesson, really. The first one I ever wrote down, right here. Daydreamers never last. So I'll maybe go out there and find myself a nightmare instead. Shaky tells us that he feels like his being has been fading away on the island, and this is why he has given himself a mission, a new goal, a new objective, so that he can finally sleep at night peacefully. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 2, Issue Number 1, Unraveling Mysteries. This begins Shaky's 18th entry into the journal, and he and the crew for the sortie, alongside Skip and Jackson, are approaching Skip's yacht. There seems to be a crossed on the boat that is making a lot of noise, and the group can gauge his presence from a mile away. Once they get close, they are confronted by a gangly and sick crossed that is puking everywhere and making a lot of noise upon their arrival. Jackson makes quick work of the sick crossed, and everyone climbs aboard while ensuring they stay away from all the fluids spilled by the crossed. Celine has been panicking ever since they spotted the crossed. She has been muttering, "Oh no," again and again under her breath. Shaky, Tabitha, Viceroy and Skip, however, are doing much better. Skip and Viceroy unload the yacht's outboard motor, while Tabitha and Shaky unload the supplies. Jackson is getting rid of the body, and Shaky says what they all have been thinking. Maybe this crossed was a trap. He was immobile after all. Somebody had slashed his hamstrings to limit its mobility. Maybe he was like a proximity alarm, designed to alert someone as soon as the yacht was boarded. Jackson thinks Shaky's speculation is nothing but wishful dreaming, but Tabitha finds it to be based on reality. However, neither of them have to wait long for proof, because they hear whistling around the Houston Bay the very next second, and before you know it, the entire yacht is rocked by a mortar shot that misses them by less than 2 feet. The entire group jumps into action, but they are working on their own priorities, and so are their brains. Celine has gone immobile and has curled up in a corner. Jackson and Shaky have jumped into overtime and are doing their best to set up everything as soon as possible. Viceroy is watching for any nearby attackers, while Tabitha is doing her best to aid Shaky and Jackson. Skip has finished mounting the motor, and he is screaming for Viceroy to start the boat. Viceroy does as he's told, and they narrowly escape the second mortar shot intended for the yacht. Skip takes the wheel while Shaky, Jackson and Tabitha struggle to keep the dinghy down. Celine is still a mess and curled up in a corner, while all Skip can think about is if his yacht suffered any damage. He keeps asking that question again and again, while Celiani keeps panicking. Shaky keeps speculating and wondering how and who could have set up this trap, and Jackson justifies this entire situation by chalking it up to coincidence. Only Viceroy seems to be calm right now, because the rest of them seem to be operating on autopilot. He seems to have spotted something on the horizon, but none of them notice him. Shaky is busy checking their back, while Tabitha and Jackson are busy tying down the dinghy to the top. Skip is still screaming for Shaky to check the engine, and Celine is still a mess. Once the dinghy is tied down, Tabitha calms Celine down, and Jackson finally admits to Shaky that it could have been a human who did this. The world, after all, is filled with crazy humans as well, because they're the ones that can survive such an environment. Skip is still incessantly asking them to check the yacht for damages, and none of them is paying attention to Viceroy. This is when Viceroy is forced to raise his voice out of concern to get all their attention, because he has heard a dingy following them, and now there's light pointed directly at them. Shaky is the only one with a sniper, so he decides to take a look using the scope. What he finds only confirms his suspicions. It's Sister Teresa and her boat from last night. They are giving chase right now, and all of this seems to have been a part of a larger plan. Shaky is sweating, but he doesn't reveal his findings to the group. He acts oblivious and doesn't say anything about Sister Teresa because the yacht will outrun them anyway. No point panicking the group right now at night, and so they drive off into the night. Still, Shaky's journal entries tell us that unraveling these mysteries about mysterious lights, Sister Teresa crossed sailing the seas, someone in Houston Bay rigging and trapping the yacht, are all part of the reason he orchestrated his escape from Carver. He wants to unravel and get to the bottom of all these mysteries. And because things have gotten messier, Shaky knows he won't be able to sleep tonight, so he is the first to take watch. And while keeping a watch, he also journals. He journals and tells us that things are going according to plan, and he likes being the first animal sent out by supposed civilized people in this new frontier to test out the waters. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 2, Issue Number 2, Passable at best, Doomed at worst. This begins Shaky's 19th entry in the journal, which tells us that the survivors decided to stop a few miles away from the town of Wick to gather their first batch of supplies. Their priority right now was fuel. They all were dressed from head to toe in protective gear. Shaky was the one helping everyone off the boat, and Celine, as usual, was panicking and lost in her thoughts of how she shouldn't be here in the first place. Her shifty, panicky state was getting on Shaky's nerves, however, he had soon found respite when the snow began to fall. It was going to make their life harder, but Tabitha had held his hand when it began to snow. She found the snow to be beautiful, and in that moment, so did Shaky. Shaky led them because he had the map, and this by default made him the leader. Shaky didn't like being the leader, but he knew nobody else could do it. We see Shaky use Jackson as the scout because of his adeptness with the wilderness. They both lead the group to a nearby gas station where they begin gathering supplies. Celine is in charge of filling up the canisters with petrol. Jackson is in charge of scouting the gas station and ensuring there are no crossed on the premises, while Viceroy and Shaky will keep a close eye on their surroundings. As everyone gets to work, Shaky tells us that the map they are using is John's, and that because he was a soldier, he marked every possible location that could have guns and ammo. Sadly, none of these locations are nearby, because in the UK, guns are quite rare to come by. Everyone knew this, including Don and Rab, so Shaky was handed a list of priorities, a way to prioritise the supplies they need, and guns and ammo were pretty low on that list. This ability to prioritise in these harsh environments once again reminds him of the gamekeeper, and how the old sod was projecting acceptable priorities while fulfilling his devious ones. Once they had found the survivors in the care facility, they were forced to stay there for 3 days due to bad weather. During this time, the gamekeeper took every chance he got to convince Sister Teresa to accompany them, to give up her mission of caring for the elderly. But Shaky remembers how resolute Sister Teresa was, and that's one of the reasons why he remembers her so fondly. She had a knack for getting under the gamekeeper's skin. However, whenever she did that, the gamekeeper vented his anger out on Agnes. He would violate her out in the rain whenever Sister Teresa got under his skin. Shaky wonders if Sister Teresa would have given in if she knew what Agnes was going through, but then again, he knows better. He knows she was a pure soul. She always understood people, which was why she hadn't probed when Shaky changed the subject upon being asked about his past. This was the first lesson Shaky had learned under the gamekeeper's rule. Shaky knew that holding on to their past lives was all they had, and it must be kept secret. He had divulged being a writer to the gamekeeper in the past, and the gamekeeper had spat it right back at Shaky the moment he learned that his skills were useless. It was part of why he knew next to nothing about the survivors since his arrival on Carver in the past year and a half. Ignorance in these times is also a survival strategy. We then catch up with the survivors at the gas station again. All of the survivors of the island are terrible at their job. Celienne is struggling to decant fuel from the cars and is puking everywhere. Viceroy is stumbling in the snow with a loaded gun, and his first idea is to shoot when he spots movement on the horizon. Crossed. Wish You Were Here. Volume 2, Issue number 3. What's Your Story? The journal entry from the last comic continues and shows us Shaky and Viceroy discussing what they should be doing next. Viceroy wants to check out the movement, but Shaky wants to hold back. Viceroy is like a kid who wants to check it out, hoping for an animal on the horizon that they could eat. He's hoping it's a rabbit, but all Shaky can think at this moment as he holds Viceroy back is the phrase, "Fools rush in where angels fear to tread," and this reminds him of the ruthless gamekeeper once again. After 3 days and Sister Teresa's utter denial to accompany them, the gamekeeper had enacted a plan. Their only other compatriot that we weren't privy to yet is finally introduced. His name was Ashoke, a Pakistani who had saved the gamekeeper's life several times before Shaky had joined them. The gamekeeper had simply come in on the 4th day, claiming that Ashoke was frothing from his mouth and overdosing on pills he must have stolen from the care home. This forced Sister Teresa to rush to his aid, but what they found was quite different from the gamekeeper's claims. Ashoke was simply knocked out, and all their supplies, including their backpacks, were outside. Shaky remembers that in that instant he knew what the gamekeeper was going to do, and we then see the gamekeeper trigger the fire alarm of the care facility the very next second. Shaky and Ashoka are forced to hide along with Sister Teresa and the Thackerys, while the gamekeeper is seen rushing out with the remaining supplies with a huge grin on his face. Sister Teresa tried to go back to the aid of the other survivors in the care home, but Shaky had to forcefully hold her back because he knew it was too late. The Crossed arrived within an hour and spent the entire evening ransacking the facility while killing and violating any survivor they encountered. Once they were done and Sister Teresa had seen everything, she was forced to accompany them, and this had been the gamekeeper's plan all along. Shaky tells us that she did not speak after the incident for 3 days, but this incident reminds him of the ruthlessness it takes for a leader to lead in these times and for the survivors to survive. He hates this realization realization, but recognizes it nonetheless. And this realization is driven home when, despite his warnings, Viceroy in the present day goes to check out the movement on the horizon and finds a crossed child. Viceroy, the old man, is morbidly fascinated by the crossed child and its misery. For some reason, Viceroy wants to end its misery, but they can't waste a bullet. He then speculates using a knife and keeps inching closer to the child. However, that is when the child leaps at Viceroy, and he is narrowly saved by Jackson, who pulls him back in the nick of time. And that is when the ice underneath the child gives away, and Shaky realizes the truth. They were standing on the edge of a lake, and the thin ice had just saved their lives. At this moment, Shaky realizes they have nothing but luck. All they had was luck. They weren't ruthless, they weren't skilled, and they weren't survivors. They were just lucky. Luckily, the mortar shot had missed the yacht thanks to the wind. Lucky that the thin ice had saved Viceroy, and lucky that they had found 5 tins of dog food and 8 packs of batteries on this excursion. We then see the survivors loading all they found back onto the yacht, and in this moment, Shaky confesses that even though they're lucky, life is quite good, which is why he poses the question, "What's your story?" to everyone. Shaky is playing at something here, something that will ascertain future events. Crossed, Wish You Were Here, Volume 2, Issue number 4, Skip's Cowardice. And so this begins Shaky's 20th entry into his journal, and it starts with the question he had previously asked the group, which he has dreaded since being under the gamekeeper's guidance. What's your story? No one answered the question at first. Seliane continued crying as usual, while Viceroy and Tabitha simply stared off into the distance. Moments passed, and then minutes passed. Skip finally answered the question. He was going to tell them about his escape from Blackpool and how he ended up on cover with them. Skip's story is juxtaposed by the next day's expedition of the survivors. Shaky tells us the story while gathering supplies the next day, and according to him, Skip has a perfect family. That part everyone knew, but no one knew about his big brother until now. His big brother was the one who did all the heavy lifting, while Skip and his family simply supported the business wherever it was useful. The group is dropped off on the next point on their map by Skip using the dinghy, and they all walk off to gather supplies alongside Jackson. Jackson leads the charge this time, and before long, they stumble upon an overturned fuel tanker that they can use to fill up their jerry cans. As they do this, we see that on the day of the outbreak, Skip's brother had gone back into the town to get some aluminum while he was in charge of staying on the boat. That is when an RAF plane had crashed into their town, but the citizens didn't make anything of it just yet. After all, it was just a plane crash. They were hearing the news coming out of London, roadblocks, and army retaliation, but none of the people in the town connected the two events. Skip's brother was gravely injured in the accident, and his right arm was amputated. His right eye was injured as well, and Skip was more than sad about this accident. Meanwhile, the day's expedition is going as planned. Shaky is keeping watch while Tabitha and the rest of them fill up as much fuel as possible. As Shaky recounts, that what Skip feared the most was now being in charge, just like his brother after the accident, we see him spot something on the horizon. His worst fears come true when he watches 2 crossed cycle out of the mist wielding rather horrid weapons, a blood-covered chain and a garden scythe. This is juxtaposed by Skip's family watching the town of Blackpool burn down from the pier as the sea virus begins to take over its citizens. We are then shown Skip telling the story at night, desperately trying to convince himself and the rest of them that he did indeed try to save his brother. This is juxtaposed by the group running away from the crossed in the present day, while Jackson faces off against them alone. He calls them cowards and then shoots one of the crossed in the head while jumping over the scythe. Seliane's breakdown has been intensifying because all she can repeat right now is, "Did he get them? Did he get them? Did he get them?" Jackson comes out of the shadows wielding the scythe and informs them that the 2 crossed have been taken care of, no thanks to them, but there are likely more on the way. This scene is juxtaposed by Skip's justifications at night and all the horrid things he saw on the way to the hospital. All the scenes made him choose to leave his brother behind because he wouldn't have survived this world anyway. We then see Skip being chased by a mob of the crossed as he approaches his yacht on the pier. This is juxtaposed by the survivors running away in the snow as they get chased down by 3 more crossed riding bicycles. Skip managed to narrowly escape, and so did the survivors in the modern day by heading off the road and into the thicker snow. When they make this choice, for a second Shaky is sure that he sees a silhouette on top of the hill, but the very next second it's gone, and it's as though there was nothing there at all. Jackson forces him to continue, and they all watch the Crossed brutally stumble over one another as they try to chase them. Skip's most personal confession juxtaposes this scene, that despite having left his brother behind, he was crying tears of joy as he drove the boat away from the pier. This scene is just like the next one, where the survivors continue running up the hill while laughing at the Crossed that are piled down below. However, the same silhouette that Shaky saw earlier comes into view again ominously as the survivors escape. Crossed, Wish You Were Here, Volume 2, Issue number 5, Tabitha's Turn. This is the 21st entry in the journal, and it starts by showing us an abandoned town 3 miles away from the village of Brora. This is their first time staying the night away from Skip and the boat, and Shaky knows that this was bound to happen sooner or later. They had emptied all the supplies from the towns close to the coast in the past year, and they were being forced to head inland more and more. Celine's mental condition has continued to degrade, and Shaky and Jackson have formed a sort of symbiotic leadership, just like Don and Rab back on the island. Shaky takes care of the broader plan, resources and next moves, while Jackson keeps eyes on the macro by managing their immediate survival needs. And so that night, when Shaky asks for another story, it's Tabitha who speaks up. She is quite objective about her story because it's a personal one, and because she wants to hide her emotions. She tells everyone that she used to be an art teacher and that she was sleeping with one of her students. Their routine was to meet up each Thursday for a session of lovemaking. She then says that when the outbreak happened, she hid in the attic of the art department right above the kitchen. She had plenty of supplies and even a few of the playground. And like clockwork, the Crossed students, including the one she was sleeping with, would come to school each day as if nothing had changed. And so eventually, as the days passed, Tabitha got bored and decided to connect with her favourite student. She decided to paint his picture on the spot he frequented. She continued this practice until the Crossed student finally responded by painting Tabitha's image using blood. However, this is the moment Tabitha starts crying, and Jackson uses this opportunity to break away under the pretext of checking the perimeter. The story continues, and Tabitha tells everyone that this moment of weakness was unacceptable to the other Crossed. They killed her favourite student and then stopped coming to the school forever. She then tells them that this experience made her form a theory about the Crossed, that the infection strips away the ability to convey and articulate emotions from the infected. Violence and violation are the only forms of creativity that are allowed. Before she can continue, Jackson comes in and says that he has spotted movement, but it's already too late before Shaky can mobilize and grab his rifle. A man has found them, and he is climbing in through the window while directly pointing a rifle to Celine's head. Crossed, Wish You Were Here, Volume 2, Issue number 6, Contact. And so begins the 22nd entry in the journal, and it starts with a heated confrontation between the mysterious gunman and his survivors. He isn't alone. He is accompanied by someone who is currently out of sight but within earshot. They're threatening to kill Celine if Shaky and the survivors don't hand over their supplies. Guns are rare in the UK, so Jackson instantly recognizes the one wielded by their attacker, a Winchester 92 with a custom 44 barrel, an ancient relic whose bullets would be hard to find even before the outbreak. They quickly catch on to the attacker's bluff, and we learn that the kid is named Richie, and he is accompanied by a bully leader named Jasper. However, instead of Jackson, Shaky now takes over the conversation and promises the two men a place in their safe sanctuary if they promise to help them all gather supplies. Till then, he will be keeping the gun, and they reluctantly agree. Shaky tells them to meet the group in Dornoch 10 miles away tomorrow. As Jasper and Richie leave, Jasper reveals that he has a thermal imaging device which should make it easy for him to catch up with the group. Neither the group nor did Jackson approve Shaky's choice, but he too is bound by the responsibilities of being leader and the list given by the leaders of Carver. On the list are various things, supplies, but at the bottom is also the listing, useful survivors. We see the survivors get dropped off near Dornoch the next morning as Shaky contemplates how he's supposed to perceive the word useful when it comes to survivors. questions. He is haunted by the memories of his past with the gamekeeper as he contemplates the same but takes respite in the fact that they haven't encountered any crossed till now. However, his happiness is short-lived because after a few minutes, the group realizes that Jackson is gone. He has left them. They knew this was bound to happen, but they never knew it would be so abrupt. Shaky continues leading the group, but it is clear to him that their faith in him is lessening with each passing minute as they gather supplies. At night, Shaky is taking count of their inventory and what they found today: fishing hooks, tinned peaches, and antiseptic. The others still follow in the footsteps of Jackson and refuse to cook food today as well. And as Shaky continues to journal, Viceroy questions his choice of joining forces with unknown and untrusted survivors. Shaky tries to rationalize his choice by saying that the two looked like useful men, but that is when Viceroy spots movement near their hideout. Moments later, Jasper and Richie come into view. However, the sad part is that they're not alone. They have come with their entire crew, and together they're a group of 6 survivors. They outnumber Shaky's crew, and it is revealed that Don and Rab have asked Shaky to bring along only 2 useful survivors. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 2, Issue number 7, Baseless Hope. This is the 23rd entry, and Shaky is recording this after a few days, mainly because he has been dreading confessing his actions. He has given Jasper's crew a new hope, which has made him feel quite guilty. There is only room for 2 aboard the boat, but his crew consists of 6 people. For the past few days, Jasper's crew has been travelling on foot, while Shaky and his companions have been travelling by boat. They meet up at predetermined locations to gather supplies, and all these days, Shaky has been hoping that evolution would do its thing and weed out the weakest one, so that his job of selecting someone would be a tad bit easier. His wish seems to be coming true because Jasper's crew has brought along around 32 crossed that are currently chasing them from a hill and down into a valley. Thankfully, the survivors managed to create a bridge using a huge tree, and they hope that the river will take care of the crossed. Shaky and his companions cross first because they know the location of the sanctuary. Jasper is the first one to follow them, and Shaky tells us that he is a pretentious leader who dreams of becoming a soldier and uses his anger and bullying to hide his fear. He then tells us about Richie as he crosses the bridge. Richie is here on a scholarship from Kenya and is a dedicated man, sometimes too dedicated to following orders. He lets Jasper bully and abuse him regularly. Then there is Dolores, a retired dental nurse that Shaky knows Don and Rab wouldn't like to have on the island because it has been 15 years since she last picked up a medical tool. Then there is Mark, a cheesemaker tiptoeing the line of insanity who likes to make jokes every chance he gets. He is a dicey one, but Shaky knows everyone on the island would kill for cheese, and they already have sheep. The next one to cross the bridge is Miranda, a capable, strong Maori woman who Shaky suspects is gay. She is useful in the eyes of Don and Rab, but he isn't sure if they would appreciate the competition regarding the choice of mates. The last one to cross the bridge is Barry, an old man who is a walking medical miracle if Jasper's crew are to be believed. He was puked upon by a crossed directly in the face, but Barry managed to survive the entire ordeal. He could be their key to a cure, but that is, if they had an army of scientists at their disposal, which they do not. Once everyone has crossed the makeshift bridge, they all push the tree into the river. However, at the last moment, Celine is pulled along with the tree and into the water. She manages to grab a few rocks on the shore, but Shaky tells us that in that moment he was tempted to let nature take its course, a useless one from his crew in exchange for a useful one from Jasper's crew. It was a sweet deal, and Shaky might have gone through with it if it hadn't set a bad example for both crews, and so he saved Celine. But in that moment, a crossed chucked a knife at her from the shore while screaming, "Hadouken!" and Celine managed to duck at the right moment to tie her laces. The knife missed her by millimeters and hit Barry instead, and so nature did take its course, and Barry was lost to the river. Not the ideal candidate, but one less nonetheless, making selecting who goes with them a bit easier for Shaky. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 2, Issue number 8, Ayuilian. This begins Shaky's 23rd entry into the journal, and Shaky has now come to terms with his heinous crime. He has accepted and is lamenting the fact that he is stringing along Jasper's crew in the hopes of taking them back to the sanctuary he hails from. He tells us that the 2 crews have formed a monotonous routine. They split ways at night, meet up in the morning, gather supplies, and then split again. It has been 4 days since the last entry, and this routine is broken up the next day day when Jasper's crew shows up to meet Shaky's without Jasper in sight. Only Dolores, Mark, Miranda, and Richie show up for the meetup. This sticks out to Shaky, and he begins projecting. Once all of them have gone inside their current safe house, Shaky confronts Richie and asks him what he did with Jasper's body. For some reason, Shaky is sure that Richie snapped and killed Jasper for bullying him all these years, but all he cares about is the body. Shaky doesn't want Jasper getting turned and then coming back to hunt them with all their secrets. But Richie clearly hasn't done anything. The black eye is simply from last night's altercation, and this makes Shaky realize that he might be projecting. This begins the flashback of his time with the gamekeeper and how much he had wanted to kill him once Sister Teresa had joined them. He used to constantly abuse Agnes, and one night when Agnes overdosed on pills out of sheer hatred for her existence, Shaky knew the gamekeeper was going to target Sister Teresa, but even then he was too weak. He didn't have the balls to kill their leader who was responsible for their survival, so he did the next best thing. Sister Teresa and Shaky pretended to sleep with each other, which thankfully worked in their favour and averted the gamekeeper's advances. Back in the present day, Richie confesses what Shaky already knows. Jasper left with all of their supplies and that he never killed him. Shaky apologises to Richie and tells him that he might have been projecting. Once Richie has gone inside for some much needed rest, we see Shaky dropping off a letter for someone named Aoi Leanne out in the wild. Meanwhile, the survivors discover that Jasper took not only the supplies they had gathered, but also their personal supplies. The next page shows Jasper discovering the letter addressed to Aoi Leanne, which reveals the location of the sanctuary. He tosses the letter aside and is determined to find the sanctuary on his own. As he walks away into the mist, we see the letter get picked up by a mysterious shadow wearing boxing gloves. The letter's glimpse reveals the location of Carver Island, and it seems that Shaky has doomed everyone. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 2, Issue number 9, The Last Stop. This 24th entry into the journal begins a few days later. Shaky and the rest have managed to gather all the supplies on the list. All remains are guns and ammo. They have checked all the hunting shops on the way, but haven't found anything. This is why they are being forced to check out one of the places marked by John on his map, Fort George. As the group makes their way there using Skip's yacht, Shaky tells us that Celine has been constantly moaning throughout their journey, and it hasn't stopped. It has begun to annoy him lately, and he has been becoming more apathetic like the gamekeeper. Skip has been looking ahead, using the binoculars as they approach Fort George, and what he sees is stuff of nightmares. Millions of seagulls flock the fort, and as they approach, they see why that is. Hundreds of Crossed are trying to get inside, while a huge banner on the fort reads, "Travelers not safe, go away." As they approach the Crossed spot their boat and have begun swimming towards them, Shaky needs to act fast, and so he asks Tabitha to create a huge banner that they can use for communication. He tells Skip to be on his toes, and he and Viceroy hold up the banner as they approach the fort. The banner reads, "Need guns and ammo, trade." As they get nearer, the soldiers from the base respond using a loudspeaker. They have been holed up in the fort for quite some time now, which is why they are ready to trade weapons and ammo in exchange for supplies and medicines. Shaky has gotten all they need, and the boat retreats swiftly before either of the Crossed get to them. Over the next few hours, Shaky decides to get medical supplies from the nearby city of Inverness. Going to cities is a big no, but considering the amount of Crossed piled up outside Fort George, he is sure that the city is empty. When they reach there, they meet up with what remains of Jasper's crew, and these journal entries tell us how apathetic Shaky has become. He was using Jasper's crew as a test run for Inverness. If the city had any Crossed, they would be the ones to be attacked. He was using them as disposable items. His apathy has begun to take over because once they meet, Celine begins to cry again, and Shaky, out of sheer apathy, tells her to give it a rest. This makes him a monster in the eyes of the rest of the survivors, but Shaky tells us he doesn't care. He finds being apathetic a bit liberating in these times. However, he can't help but wonder how he is becoming more and more like the gamekeeper. They enter the city to find it empty and barren, and quickly end up finding an intact pharmacy. As the survivors wonder how they're going to get the supplies inside Fort George, Mark shows them an almost intact ambulance as though a clear sign from fate itself. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 2, Issue number 10, Volunteers. This is the 25th entry in Shaky's journal, but it recounts the night from the same day they found the ambulance. The crew, along with Jasper's people, are currently inside an abandoned house while preparing meals, dreading what they all know is coming. Once most of them have had their meals, Shaky does it. He asks for volunteers, and this prompts Viceroy to speak up because he has been the most useless among them, and lately he has been on a lucky streak. Shaky's journal entries tell us that he envies the old man because being lucky once used to be his job, but Viceroy is right. Even today he was lucky because when they were loading the medical supplies into the ambulance, he was attacked by a straggler crossed and mysteriously saved by the same shadow that we saw picking up Shaky's letter a few comics ago, covered from head to toe in what looks like black cloth taped on his body with boxing gloves for his hands. The shadow left the scene just as quickly as it had arrived, but Viceroy is sure that it was a crossed. Shaky, however, couldn't care less. After all, his rule for mysteries is to ignore them and move on. Shaky diverts the group's attention to the need for volunteers, and they reluctantly ignore the shadow once again. Viceroy then decides to tell them his story, but that is when Celine jumps the gun and volunteers for the job. This is quite awkward and odd because she interrupts Viceroy abruptly and instead begins telling her story instead. Shaky is aware of the awkwardness, but lets her carry on. Celine reveals that she and her family were caravanning throughout Scotland during the summer. It was a happy family, but the outbreak happened when they were camping near this city of Inverness. They heard what was happening over the radio in their cabin, and eventually they ran out of supplies. Her husband was sick, so she was the only one who could drive the caravan to the city to get what they needed. Her husband was reluctant at first because she couldn't drive stick shift, but once they were starving, he gave in. Celine tells us that although she initially clashed the gears, she eventually found her groove and drove into the city. The city was empty, so she gathered all the needed food and supplies and drove back. But once she reached the cabin, she found her husband and son being massacred by the crossed. The sound of the gears clashing had drawn them in, and she was responsible for their deaths. And this is the reason she is volunteering for the job. It's her twisted way of repenting. Shaky has grown to hate Celine in the past few days, but he knows that guilt can be one hell of a motivator, and so he decides to give her the job. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 2, Issue number 11, Needs. This is the 26th entry in the journal, and Shaky has been taken aback by how calm Celine is and the fact that she is treating this job like she is going on a date. She is applying makeup, which makes Shaky wonder how futile all of these things, such as seduction and prepping up, have become in this world. Survival needs outweigh everything, even consent, and it has taken him a year and a half to realise this. Even back then, when the gamekeeper regularly abused Agnes in the name of rent, they were struggling to come to terms with this. Their need for survival outweighed everything. They could have helped her, banded together, and killed him, but they needed him and his skills to survive in the world. The incident he is remembering is from the forest, and he remembers Agnes trying to offer up Sister Teresa to him instead, but he had threatened to kill her if she woke up Teresa. Even Lloyd had tried to stand up for Agnes, but he was simply knocked out using the butt of the gamekeeper's rifle. Shaky and Ashoke had simply watched as Agnes once again was abused by him, all because they needed him. Back in the present day, Celiene has dressed herself and has applied too much makeup for the job, and all Shaky can do is give her an awkward thumbs up in return. Jasper's crew then asks what they are supposed to be doing while Celine delivers the goods, and without remorse, Shaky once again resumes the job of the gamekeeper and tells them the same thing, that it's about time they paid their rent. They will be responsible for creating a distraction, and just like Shaky and the Thackeray's back then, they all hate him. But just like the gamekeeper, he no longer cares. The need for validation is long gone. And this idea of distraction is something he has stolen from Agnes, because after the incident in the forest, she had tried to avert the gamekeeper's attention from herself by stealing Sister Teresa's clothes. Not only that she had exposed Teresa in the presence of the gamekeeper and had offered her a skimpy see-through outfit as a replacement for her robes. Shaky remembers how he was an ideal nice guy back then because he had saved Teresa by offering her his robes instead. Jasper's crew in the present day is hurling abuses at him, but he doesn't care. He is just like the gamekeeper back then. He knows they need him, and so it is all set. Celiene is ready for the drive while the others have been designated to create a distraction. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 2, Issue number 12, Overlooking the Obvious. Shaky's keeping a close eye on Fort George while ignoring abuses being hurled at him by Miranda and the rest of Jasper's crew. He even tells them to go survive on their own if they don't want to go to the sanctuary, because they only have space for 2 people on the boat. For the first time in weeks, Tabitha expresses how pathetic Shaky has become, and in reply, he confesses to her that he is hoping this is just an act until they reach Carver, hoping that he is doing this for survival and not actually turning into this horrid person. Reluctantly, Miranda, Mark, Dolores and Richie get into a stolen car and drive off to create a distraction. Miranda is driving the car and they manage to draw all the Crossed to them pretty easily. Things go south when one of the Crossed manages to shoot Miranda in the leg, but she manages to make the escape nonetheless. Celine easily drives the ambulance into the fort while the soldiers keep the remaining Crossed away from the gate, and for once, Shaky is pleased that a plan has gone as he intended. They then wait 3 hours like they had planned, and once the 3 hours have passed, he asks Jasper's crew to create a distraction again. However, this time Viceroy offers himself up to drive the car instead of Miranda, and Shaky reluctantly agrees. As he drives off, out of compassion, Tabitha offers to listen to his story once he is back, and we see Viceroy's luck come into play once again, because even though the old man stalls the car at the front gates, he manages to get it running again before the Crossed can get to them. Viceroy and the rest execute their job of creating a distraction perfectly, but the gates don't open, and Celine doesn't drive out, and this makes Shaky realise that they might have been duped. The soldiers might have never wanted to trade in the first place. Crossed, Wish You Were Here, Volume 2, Issue number 13, Time to Solve Mysteries. Shaky is sitting on a barrel surrounded by crossed bodies in Fort George as he writes the 27th entry. He shoots a still-alive Crossed in the head and tells us that the day has been quite eventful and anticlimactic. The entire fort is a massacre with a huge hole in the boundary wall where the gates should have been. Through Shaky's story, we realise that the survivors at first tried a few more distractions, hoping that the soldiers were simply delayed, but by night they came to terms with the fact that they had been duped. However, while sleeping, they were woken up by a loud explosion, and when they climbed a tree to see what had happened, they saw the entirety of Fort George up in flames. When they reached the fort, no one was alive, neither were the soldiers nor the Crossed. The guns were theirs for the taking, so they had a fun time shooting the remaining Crossed that were barely alive. However, the mystery of what had happened began eating at Shaky's mind, and when he found a dismembered finger with a grenade pin attached to it, he couldn't help but look around for more clues because something peculiar was afoot, something that he should have started paying attention to a long time ago. Crossed, Wish You Were Here, Volume 2, Issue number 14, The Theory of What Happened at Fort George. Tabitha and the rest are busy loading weapons and supplies into the ambulance while Shaky walks around aimlessly trying to figure out what happened. He finds a cut rope and then a locked door in the interior of the fort. When he opens the door, he is ambushed by a Crossed child who is promptly killed by Richie, who has been looking over Shaky while gathering weapons and supplies. However, Shaky is too lost in his thoughts, busy solving the mystery of the explosion. He continues walking into the locked room and finds a half-naked soldier with a black eye and a knife in his neck. Apart from the mystery, he has another responsibility. Now that Celine's dead, there's room for 3 people on the boat, and he will have to choose 3 people from Jasper's crew instead of 2. Shaky then tells us that he has solved the mystery as he stands near the front gates that have been blown apart from the inside. Someone blew up the gates from the inside. The Crossed barged in. The soldiers died fighting the Crossed. That's the big picture, but the smaller picture is where it all begins, and it was all his mistake. The soldier he found in the locked room had an erection, but since he has been on the base, he hasn't found evidence of a non-Crossed female, and so it's obvious that the base was full of male soldiers, and they had begun violating Celine the moment she stepped foot into the base. When she got the chance, she kicked the soldier, which resulted in the black eye, stole a knife during the scuffle, and stabbed him in the neck. She then untied herself, which would explain the piece of rope he found on the way inside, and then stole a grenade and blew herself up near the gate. This would explain the dismembered finger he found near the entrance with the pin still attached. He explains all of this to the rest of the survivors and then calls Celine a hero. It will be tough to choose who will return to Carver with them because neither of them could match up to Celine's bravado. Crossed, Wish You Were Here, Volume 2, Issue number 15, The Illusion of Choice. This is the 28th entry into Shaky's journal, and theme of the entire narration is fairness. Shaky has decided to make his choice for the survivors accompanying him to Carver, using a drawer of straws, just like the lottery held by Don and Rab back at the island. The choice seems fair to everyone around him, and this reminds him of another memory of his time with the gamekeeper. It reminds him of the night when they had found a shop of shooting and and fishing supplies. The shop was completely intact and full of things they needed and luxuries that they craved: booze, guns, cigarettes, and more. Shaky kept Sister Teresa company while Ashok and Lloyd tried to open the gun cage. This was when the gamekeeper had decided to abuse Agnes again, and this time Shaky had gone outside in an attempt to stop the gamekeeper once and for all. He remembers the moment he laid eyes on the gamekeeper and Agnes and spotted Lloyd looking at them from the ventilation window. At that moment, Shaky felt powerful because he and Lloyd were itching to stop the gamekeeper from abusing Agnes. After all, they had found more supplies and guns, which reduced their need to rely heavily on the gamekeeper. However, as Shaky looks back at this memory in the modern day while having the survivors draw sticks, he feels more and more stupid for his choice back then, because it was simply the illusion of choice, just like the one he is offering the survivors right now. We then see Miranda and Richie pick the bigger straws, but Shaky changes Mark's choice when he's about to go for the shorter one. Dolores, he chose her to be left behind while offering the others the illusion of choice to spare them the guilt. When Dolores is left with the last straw, she can't help but complain that the method is unfair. It is the same thing Agnes was complaining about while getting abused by the gamekeeper back then, that only her getting abused by him wasn't fair. However, Shaky remembers Ashoke getting the gun cage open at that moment, and he remembers that all hell was about to break loose. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 2, Issue number 16, Breaking Point. The last entry continues and shows us the survivors aboard Skip's yacht, heading back to Carver. They are all sad about leaving Dolores behind, and their only respite is that they had left her with plenty of supplies. However, they all know she won't survive on her own, and before long, everyone, including Miranda, is breaking down in tears. Even Shaky was on the verge of it, and he was staring at the horizon to keep himself from coming to terms with what he had done. He was ignoring and staying away from his breaking point, which Lloyd had reached once the gun cage was open back then, and Viceroy had reached right now because he had decided to fill the silence on the yacht with his story. Viceroy tells everyone that he had been passive all his life, never making a choice and letting life happen to him. When his mother died, when he lost his job, and when a thief broke into his house, and he too reached his breaking point when he found his wife cheating on him willingly, that is when a switch flipped inside Viceroy's head and he murdered his wife and her lover in cold blood. This revelation is juxtaposed by Shaky's memory of Lloyd taking the gun and heading outside to confront the gamekeeper. On the boat, however, everyone is waiting for Viceroy to complete his story, and after a moment of silence, he does. He tells everyone that he was in jail, waiting for his trial when the outbreak happened, and every inmate was set free by the officers. That is when his lucky streak began. It was as though the universe was paying its debt for what it had done to Viceroy, because he was able to easily walk out of the prison. No one paid any attention to him. And this is when he tells them about his take on the outbreak. According to him, that this is simply the humans as a species reaching their breaking point and realizing the cosmic truth. The stunned silence on the boat, Shaky sitting on his own, is starkly juxtaposed by the determination and hunger for blood in Lloyd's eyes as he walks towards the gamekeeper and Agnes. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 2, Issue number 17, Haunted by the Past. This is Shaky's 29th entry into the journal, and it's an agitated one. He sits on the Carver Island with the other survivors as he tells us what has happened in the past few hours. Because of the mortar incident the last time they were in Houston, Skip has decided to park the yacht in the town of Stromness instead. They were able to easily offload the supplies, but when Miranda pointed out a red glow on the horizon in the middle of the night, Shaky couldn't help himself from being intrigued. As he writes, he wonders if his mental itch has been scratched, and if his mental state has improved. He has ignored mysteries all this while, but now wants to solve them. Maybe the sortie has changed him. Maybe is indeed a changed man, because he, Viceroy and Richie are headed to check out the red glow on the horizon. However, when they get there, they find a hellish landscape, all thanks to the presence of hundreds of crossed, indulging in violent and debaucherous acts at the standing stones of Stennis. When all of them decide to take a closer look through their binoculars, a chill runs down Shaky's spine. He finds what he has been fearing, what he has been running away from: a naked crossed nun surrounded by soldiers from Fort George, using a staple gun on her face while she has her arms spread out wide. Shaky instantly abandons the mission and heads back while Viceroy gives him an introspective look. The rest of them have managed to load their supplies on the dinghy, and Shaky quickly makes them leave Stromness while avoiding Viceroy Viceroy and Richie's questions about what they saw. When they reach Carver, he tells the new survivors that they will have to wait till morning to meet the rest of the islanders. If they head to Eden now, they will be shot down, and so they wait on the shores just like we saw on the first page. And it is revealed what has gotten Shaky so agitated. Viceroy recognized the look on Shaky's face when he saw the nun, and he wanted to know how Shaky was associated with her. Shaky simply refuses to answer when Viceroy asks, "What's your story?" and walks away, leaving both us and Viceroy in the dark. Crossed. Wish You Were Here, Volume 2, Issue 18, Shaky's Comeuppance. Shaky's 30th entry in the journal begins with a tone of regret. He is now journaling in his hammock while telling us that everything on Carver has changed. He then recounts the events of the day for us, saying that a lot has happened. Shaky was hyping up Carver for the new recruits when they spotted 3 islanders making their way towards them. However, instead of a warm greeting, shots were fired at them. However, none of them were hurt. Only Viceroy's torso was grazed by a bullet, and when Shaky had confronted them angrily, his worst nightmare had come true. It was Elisa and Des who thought that they were the Crossed, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Jasper accompanied them, and Jasper had told all the islanders what Shaky had done. He had told them all about the letters, and how Shaky had been leaving letters for someone named Awileyan like breadcrumbs throughout their journey. Jasper's face reminds Shaky of Lloyd, and what happened when he had confronted the gamekeeper. Although Lloyd had managed to get the upper hand by pointing the gun to the gamekeeper's head, tables had turned instantly when the gamekeeper had realised that Shaky was there too. This is because the gamekeeper had called Shaky's bluff. You see, Shaky wasn't there to help Lloyd defeat the gamekeeper, but instead ensure his survival. And when Lloyd had realised this and faltered, the gamekeeper had turned around instantly and shot him in the crotch. Agnes's suffering was rendered futile, and Lloyd's last moments on Earth were spent watching his wife get abused by the gamekeeper once again, while he held Ashok and Shaky away at gunpoint. And as Elisa and Des confront Shaky about Awileyan in the present day, we see that just like right now, Shaky's secret was revealed back then as well, because Sister Teresa had rushed out of the shop after the gunshot and had seen the gamekeeper abusing Agnes and had realised what had been happening all along. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 2, Issue number 19, The Rest of the Day. Shaky's 30th entry continues and he tells us about his horrid day. He tried to chalk up his letters as simple self-therapy in front of the islanders, but he confesses that none of them believed him because he didn't believe his own lie himself. He was called out by Elisa, who blamed him for leaving trails to their sanctuary that anyone could find. And it was clear to Shaky at that moment that the tide was turning in favour of Jasper. Everyone favoured him for his ways, but if there was one thing he had learned from his time on the sortie was proactivity, so he tried that. He had tried to talk to Des to make him realise how Jasper was poisoning them, but it was of no use. Jasper is a man of action, and Des craves violence so naturally he likes Jasper. In fact, him, Elisa and Jasper were headed out right now to check out the Crossed they saw on the standing stones of Stennis. Shaky had then tried to talk to Jamie, but had realised quickly that he liked Jasper too. In fact, Jamie was sweet on Jasper. The women of the island hated him as well for cheating on the lottery and using the child to blackmail Rab. As for the Masouds, they simply wanted to be left alone, and Des's daughter Chanice wanted nothing to do with Shaky's views on Jasper because her father was happy with his life after a long time. Even Skip had decided to go along with the flow because his wife, Jackie, and son Lance had managed to change his mind. The new recruits all hated him for tricking them, and only Richie came at night to pay Shaky a visit. He was new, so he couldn't go against the majority, but reassured Shaky that Jasper was a bad man he should have killed long ago. Shaky then sees Richie's black eye and realises that Jasper's bullying Richie again, and this only left Rab and Don as his only confidants. They hated Shaky and made no effort to hide it, but they hated Jasper more. He was too violent for their sanctuary, and so they were his allies for now. But as Shaky is journaling this into the night, we see him get ambushed by Jasper. Jasper holds a knife to Shaky's throat and leads him outside because he knows Shaky is planning something with Rab and Don as his partners. He knows about their secret meeting while he was gone, but Shaky isn't about to back down. Shaky knows that Jasper is a wannabe soldier and he has faced far worse than him. After all, he has faced the abuse of the gamekeeper, so he isn't going to stand for Jasper's actions. However, the tables quickly turn when Jasper places the knife under Shaky's crotch and tells him to stay out of his way. What's worse is that he reveals that he has been sleeping sleeping with Elisa and Roshan, and he knows that Shaky isn't man enough to change the mind of the entire island on his own. Crossed, Wish You Were Here, Volume 2, Issue number 20, Lack of Hesitation. The 30th diary entry continues, and Shaky tells us that after last night's confrontation, he was banished by the islanders and now has to live in the drover's cottage, which is on the east edge of the island and away from all the defences. Tabitha visited him, but just to say that she can't be seen with him anymore. Richie brought him some food, but that was the extent of his visit. Only Rab and Don stayed the longest, and they did so simply because they wanted to crib about Jasper and his latest decisions. Shaky knew where this was going. He needed to be bold at this moment. Bold when making his decisions without hesitation, just like Sister Teresa back in the day. We then see a mysterious scene where Agnes is on the floor weeping for her husband, while Sister Teresa confronts the gamekeeper. He is seeking her approval and apologising to her for some reason while Agnes runs away. Shaky doesn't reveal how this happened, but draws inspiration from the same and asks Don and Rab to get to the point. The two leaders hesitate for a moment, but then reveal their plans to Shaky. Through any means, they want Jasper dead, and they want Shaky's help to do so. Shaky's 31st journal entry begins the very next morning after this meeting. He laments the choices he has made in the past few weeks. His choices have driven the islanders away from him, just like he drove away Jackson at the start of their journey. He is sure that Jackson knew all along what he was planning to do with Jasper and his crew. Maybe this is why Jackson chose to survive on his own. Maybe he didn't want to be involved in the inner politics of current human survival. Shaky then reveals how Sister Teresa had been able to take the gun away from the keeper. When she had caught him in the act, she had simply walked up to him and ordered him to make the right choice. It was that simple, no hesitation in her actions, even when a gun was pointed directly at her. This had made the gamekeeper stop instantly. Shaky then tells us that he spent the entire day in the cottage, and around midday he saw a dinghy full of the Crossed passing by. He knew it was Sister Teresa stalking the island, but didn't know what she had planned. In this moment of vulnerability, Tabitha abruptly confronted him. She has shown up to ask about Aoilian, and Shaky confesses that it is someone he used to love, someone who is now dead. This confession is juxtaposed by Sister Teresa ordering the gamekeeper to stop what he is doing, and is a direct reflection of what Shaky's beloved Aoilian would have done right now if she was here with Shaky. Shaky reveals that Sister Teresa's real name before she was a part of the church was Aoilian, and she would have told him to stop right now because he was lying to Tabitha just so he could sleep with her. Through Shaky's journal entries, we learn that he was still in love with Aoilian and was convincing himself desperately every day that she was dead. But she wasn't. Shaky knew that. Shaky had seen her on the stones of Stennis, seen her in the dinghy before the journey began, and seen her today as well. Crossed, Wish You Were Here, Volume 2, Issue number 21, The Difference. The comic begins with Shaky battling with the difference between the leaders in these times as he recounts the events of the day and the past. Today, Jasper held Shaky at gunpoint using the same old Winchester rifle that Richie had used to bluff Shaky's party on the sortie the first time they met. Jasper is counting down to 0 unless Shaky stands down. This scene is juxtaposed by the gamekeeper holding Shaky at gunpoint and counting down while tears stream down his face. Shaky tells us that the gamekeeper's intent was clear through his eyes back then, which is why he had chosen to stand down. The gamekeeper had then simply calmed himself and ran away from the group. As the scene pans out, we learn what might have prompted this confrontation, because Agnes's body is hanging from a nearby tree. However, Jasper isn't like the gamekeeper. Shaky can smell the stench of defeat on him, and so he calls Jasper a faker and goes in to punch him, and this is when Jasper pulls the trigger. But this is a moment from the future and a tease by Shaky in his journal. He doesn't reveal what happened next, but instead tells us how Jasper ended up on this end of the island with him and how this confrontation started. Shaky writes this 31st entry in the journal while a mysterious pair of bloodied gloves and a knife lay beside him in the cottage. He tells us that Jasper, Richie and Viceroy showed up to his end of the island because they had been delayed and were caught up in the tide. Rish and Viceroy had been quite nice in asking him for permission permission to stay at the cottage, but Jasper was as insufferable as ever. What's more mysterious and stupid on his part was that he had found an intact crate of .44 ammo on his sortie to Houston and had brought it back with him. It was the exact caliber needed for his ancient rifle, and he had never stopped to even think how it got there when it wasn't there when Shaky was out with his party. And even though Shaky hated to be on the side of Rab and Don, they were right in this instant. Jackson was crazy. He actually wanted to fight back and had already mentioned it 4 times. This is when Shaky wonders why he likes to be a hero at the most inopportune moments. Like back in the day when they found Agnes's body, the gamekeeper had gone into a fit of rage and had begun hitting the dead body over and over again. Shaky had jumped in to be a hero, but the gamekeeper simply turned around and hit him in the face. However, a stark revelation came to all of them thanks to this action. They all had seen tears on the gamekeeper's face, something Shaky in the present day knew Jasper wouldn't be capable of. He was simply a wannabe soldier, having the time of his life while role-playing his favourite dream. And so, when a confrontation between the two had ensued, and Jasper had threatened to rape Tabitha, Shaky had lunged at him. However, Jasper had anticipated this, and in return had pointed the Winchester directly at Shaky. They all knew that he had loaded one of the recently found shells in it, and none of them were paying attention to Viceroy, who was closely examining the crate. This stand between Shaky and Jasper reminded him of the moment the gamekeeper had held him at gunpoint. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 2, Issue number 22, Anticlimactic Pattern Breaks. Shaky begins the journal by telling us that unfortunately his life has a habit of being anticlimactic, and the confrontation between him and Jasper ended the same way. When Jasper had pulled the trigger, the old metal of the ancient Winchester had given away and the gun had blown itself in Jackson's face. His hand was blown off and blood had splattered everywhere. The shrapnel had struck Richie in the head instantly, while Viceroy had managed to escape the entire thing with a blown-off ear. Shaky was too busy marvelling at Viceroy's luck, and the old man had to use the volume of his voice to make Shaky listen to him. Viceroy has been examining the 44 shells they found in Houston. They are covered in crossed excrement. This reminds him of the time he spent with Ashoka and Sister Teresa after the gamekeeper left them. It was nothing special. All he remembers from that time is the gamekeeper visiting them occasionally to make his presence known, to drop off much-needed supplies. Shaky still wonders if he did that to help them, to apologise or to keep them afraid, and to make it known that they still needed him. And then, in a couple of days, Ashoka had fallen extremely sick from the expired food they were eating, and he had said what was on everybody's mind, that they still needed the gamekeeper to survive. But this moment of Ashoka's weakness made both Sister Teresa and Shaky question their entire time with him. Did they actually need the gamekeeper? Did the Islanders ever need Don and Rab? Shaky spent the last few minutes of Viceroy's life listening to his rants. He did this partly because he felt sorry for the old man because he never meant anything to Shaky, and partly to distract his mind from the mysteries that were afoot. Was the crossed infection transmitted through excrement? Was it human excrement or crossed excrement on the shells? If it was crossed excrement, then was all of this part of an elaborate plan? And if so, who could have done this? And what kind of a human would it take to have this kind of resolve once the infection took over? Shaky knew the answer to this last question, but he pushed it out of his brain once again. He pushed away the image of Sister Teresa on the stones of Stence once again. As Viceroy struggled with the meaning of his life, Shaky had put on Richie's gloves, taken his helmet, and had broken Viceroy's neck using the butt of his rifle as the crossed rash appeared on his face. It was over, and this silence that now loomed reminded him of the silent hours he spent with Ashoka and Sister Teresa while continuing their travels. The gamekeeper's visits were less frequent now, but his gifts had increased in number. He would leave evidence of his presence for them now, warn them about traps through notes on trees and more. We then see the three of them spending the night at the top of a church while Shaky keeps watch. They are again distracted by Ashoki's ramblings, and Shaky fails to notice the gamekeeper watching the tower ominously from the ground below. Shaky abruptly cuts off this memory as he is distracted by the thought of what will happen in the morning when the Islanders find him with the dead bodies of Richie and Viceroy alongside a passed-out Jasper. But then a chill runs down Shaky's spine as he spots a light on the horizon. He quickly scrambles through Jasper's belongings, retrieves his thermal vision scope and takes a look. On the other side of Hoy, he spots hundreds of warm bodies menacingly making their way towards the shore. Crossed, Wish You Were Here, Volume 2, Issue number 23, Dirty Revelations. This is the 33rd journal entry, and it was written by Shaky while waiting for the morning to arrive 2 days later. The night after Richie and Viceroy had passed away, Tabitha had sent Don and Rab to meet him upon his request, and they had come with landmines in their hands as Shaky had wanted. The two of them were shocked to find Shaky sitting in his shack with 2 dead bodies and an unconscious Jasper. But Shaky was laser focused on the next part of his plans, which involved landmines. This laser focus, however, brought along the dreadful realization to Shaky that he might have finally become what he had been running from all this while, that he might have finally become the gamekeeper. We then see another flashback that shows the gamekeeper stalking his former crew. Shaky is smoking a cigarette outside, and the gamekeeper uses this moment of distraction to sneak inside the store where Ashoki and Sister Teresa are sleeping. This momentary lapse, this moment of thinking that things might have been alright, that the gamekeeper might have finally left them alone, is what cost his love that night. Because the gamekeeper had snuck into the store and killed Ashoka, and Shaky never heard a thing. Because Ashoka never made a sound. We all can guess what happened next as we see Shaky, Don and Rab carrying Jasper to a boat in the present. The idea is to leave him stranded on the collection of rocks between Hoy and Carver. The Scarpa flow will prevent his escape, but Shaky needs to make sure that he is unable to walk when he gets up. When Don and Rab refuse to cut his hamstrings despite being a part of this conspiracy, Shaky decides to do the job himself. He has become as ruthless as the gamekeeper, and the memory of what he saw that night once he was done smoking is only adding fuel to the fire burning inside him. Don and Rab help him place Jasper on the rocks, while Shaky assures them that they need to do this to ensure the islanders' safety. He doesn't tell them the truth of what he saw last night to the thermal vision scope. That is something he wants to keep close to his heart, but he is ready to reveal it to us. The next page is one of the most important pages in the series. It shows the contents of the letters he has been dropping off on their sortie, and the outline of a nun waving the letter through the thermal vision scope. The nun has a huge glowing X-shaped mark on her face, and it is no doubt that it's Awilian, aka Sister Thursa, and the letter is indeed addressed to her. Shaky's words in the letter are dripping with apology and guilt, and its contents essentially ask her to stay away from Carver. If by any miracle Awilian can read these letters, then Shaky wants her to stay away from the island, not because he cares for the islanders, it's because he cares for her. He knows the islanders will kill her because she has been infected, and he doesn't want that to happen. He still loves her and wants her to live, so he asks her to stay away from his abode. We then see what Shaky saw when he walked back into the store after his smoke break. The gamekeeper was raping Sister Teresa while carving an X on her face, and he had murdered Ashoka in cold blood. Crossed, Wish You Were Here, Volume 2, Issue number 24, What's Your Story, Shaky? The same night continues in the present as Shaky sits on the shore and writes in his journal. His entries tell us what happened next. Jasper finally awoke in the afternoon and began hurling abuses at the islanders, while most of them simply stood there and watched. They were turned by his words, turned when they had realized that he brought back an infected crate of ammo, but mostly turned by his vicious words and abuses. They watched as Jasper hurled abuses at them while being surrounded by seals, helpless because he couldn't move his legs and was missing a hand. But Shaky's plan was going awry, and he and the islanders were growing impatient, because unlike they had expected, the Crossed were simply sitting in their boat at a safe distance from Jasper and simply watching the show. Shaky had snatched Elisa's rifle to take a closer look, and his suspicions were confirmed. It was Awilian, aka Sister Teresa, on the boat, along with her chosen converts, which included the taped-up shadow with boxing gloves that we saw save Viceroy's life in Inverness earlier. This is when Shaky tells us his take on the Crossed and the sea virus. He doesn't care where it started or who started the outbreak. All he knows is that the virus takes away everything apart from what you hold the dearest to yourself, your deepest resolve. And this conclusion comes to Shaky in light of what he has seen Awilian go through. Her core value, her deepest resolve, was always showing restraint. It was always remaining calm in the harshest of times. In his memory, Sister Teresa remains completely still while being violated by the gamekeeper. She wasn't still out of fear, she was still calm because of her resolve. Even when she had spotted Shaky in the room, she had asked him not to shoot the gamekeeper. She didn't want him to commit a sin. This is how strong her resolve was, and Shaky is sure that she has carried this with her after being infected. It's what makes her different from the other Crossed. As the islanders join Shaky and take up binoculars to see what is happening, another shock is served to them on a silver platter as though a planned part of their 7-course meal. There is someone they know on Aoilian's boat, someone Shaky thought had died a heroic death. They have Celine, and Aoilian has had the restraint of not infecting her. Celine simply cries as the rest of her crew taunts the survivors. The boat with the Crossed begins to turn around, so in an attempt to keep his secret, Shaky triggers the landmines and blows up Jasper. He tells us that this was the second human he killed since the outbreak began, but it didn't make him feel any better, just like the first murder he had committed. We then see that the gamekeeper was Shaky's first murder of a non-Crossed human, and he had shot him in the back of the neck despite Sister Teresa's protests. Once Shaky has made his call, the islanders stand in silence and slowly walk away. Only Elisa decides to stay back and has only 2 questions for Shaky. Who was that woman, and what was his story? And just like everyone in the past, Shaky had simply shunned her away. When Elisa is gone, Shaky begins to journal as smoke rises in the distance due to the explosion. This is the moment Shaky began writing the events of the previous 2 comics for us, which means that we still don't get Shaky's full story, at least not yet. Crossed Wish You Were Here Volume 3, Issue Number 1, Springtime Gifts. This comic begins Shaky's 34th entry into the journal, 2 weeks since his last update. Shaky's words reveal that he has grown to be highly pessimistic over the past 2 weeks, and even the spring season that is upon them now only highlights what is going bad around him. The incessant rain, the lack of fish, and the conformity of life on Carver is getting to him again. The razor wire is doing its job, and so are the islanders. They still hate him. Even Tabitha won't stay the night with him because everyone hates him. And so Shaky journals as usual while avoiding most of them. And he tells us what happened once he shot the gamekeeper in the back. After the entire debacle, Sister Teresa had a fit and he helped her calm down. He used a book to prevent her from swallowing her own tongue. Once this was done, a quick glance at the gamekeeper revealed that despite the gaping wound in his back, he was still alive. And then another surprising thing happened. Jackie, who had relieved him from his lookout duty, began ringing the bell. They had visitors, 3 to be precise, and they weren't the Crossed this time. Rab goes to meet them, and minutes later, he returns to the group with a huge scowl. When they ask him what happened, Rab says, "It's worse than we thought. They're bloody Americans." Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 3, Issue Number 2, Underneath the Facade. The 34th journal entry continues as Shaky writes this in his hammock after the day's events. He tells us that after the arrival of the Americans, everyone was on the edge. Though everyone tried to act nice initially, Don and Rab weren't ready to take any chances. The 3 Americans were quickly rounded up and taken into the meeting shed and were held at gunpoint by Des and Eliza. The envoy was helmed by a hippie named Sean, and when the questions got harder, he simply offered to lead some of them to a tour of their society. Shaky, Des and Eliza were selected, and what they found was much more than they had bargained for. The Americans had a drift fleet of 33 vessels and 348 people, and it was massive. Sean gave them a nice tour and even had them meet the captain, but Shaky kept an eye out for all the discrepancies. The Americans were flaunting a lot. There were too many barnacles on their propeller compared to the amount of fuel they claimed to have. And once they got back, he conveyed this to Don and Rab once Des and Eliza were done telling their story. In his opinion, the Americans were putting up a facade. He suspected their fuel barrels to be empty, their ships to be stranded, and their situation to be dire. In short, according to Shaky, the Americans were screwed, and they didn't want the islanders to know that. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 3, Issue Number 3, The Look of Venom and the Look of Pity. Shaky's 35th entry begins, and he tells us that it's time for reciprocation. They got a tour of the American Drift Fleet, and now people from the Drift Fleet are getting to tour the island. Don and Rab are pretending to be nice and welcoming, but it's all a facade. Tabitha is the only one close to Shaky, and she can sense his disdain for all that is happening. Don is the only one who is being blunt and insufferable. He made his demands clear clear to the Americans as soon as they arrived. If by chance the Americans talk to the islanders, answer any questions, or tell them anything about the drift fleet, then all trading is off the table. Shaky knows Don fears losing his power, and for some reason, he likes seeing him so shaken up. The Americans agree to Don's demands, and their tour continues as intended. Everyone is nice to them, and this dichotomy reminds Shaky of Sister Teresa and how traumatized she was in the following days after the assault. Shaky, however, had kept a vigilant eye on her. Every time she woke up from a nightmare, he was there to console her and put her back to sleep. But he remembers the look in her eyes, that look of traumatizing memories, slithering to the front and then being pushed back. He then tells us that even Ashoka had managed to survive the gamekeeper choking him, though the loss of oxygen to his brain during those moments had mentally crippled him. He wasn't the same Ashoka anymore. He was just a shell of a human he used to be. Then one day, to ease Sister Teresa's pain, Shaky had strung up the gamekeeper to a tree and had taken Sister Teresa to see him. She wasn't pleased by this sight, and Shaky knew that it went against everything she stood for, but he wanted her to see this, because down the road it will help her, and he knew that. Once she was gone, Shaky had planted a phone on the gamekeeper with an alarm set on it that would go off every hour from the next day. He had then spewed all the hatred he had felt for the gamekeeper during their time together, and once he was done, he simply walked away. Even in his last moments, the gamekeeper had nothing but hate in his eyes, nothing but venom, and as Shaky watches Americans leave while journaling at dusk, he tells us that he saw a similar look in the Americans' eyes today. Not a look of venom, no, but a look of disdain. They didn't say anything untoward to anyone, no, but even the islanders knew and registered this look. The Americans acted nice because it was quite apparent that they were pretending, and they were pretending because they had way better lives than the islanders. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 3, Issue Number 4, Reluctance to Let Go of the Old Ways. Shaky's 36th journal entry begins a week later, and on the night after a serious showdown on the island. Shaky walks outside as he watches Don sleeping in the chamber beside him with a black eye. He tells us that during the last week, the Americans and the islanders have become quite close, but slowly and surely, they are running out of niceties and stories that they can swap. Watching the Crossed fight and then getting killed by the Scapper flow is no longer the prime entertainment. Their new neighbours are. We then see Don and Rab continuously arguing, and Don trying to assert control through fascist means as usual. He refuses to let anyone from the island go on the drift fleet, despite the Americans inviting them. Don fears that the Americans will take over the island and conquer it the first chance they get, and when he's being a prick about asserting his control on the islanders, they corner him and someone punches him. Don bleeds from the mouth as he finally agrees to let a delegation visit the drift fleet for a taste of their lifestyle. His only condition? Shaky accompanies the delegation. Shaky doesn't know or care who punched Don, but something about Don's attitude makes him question and doubt the Americans. He then remembers how tough it was to string a Shokai with them once he lost his mental fortitude. The man had no sense of decency and had essentially become a child. Yet despite Shaky's apprehensions, Sister Teresa insisted on letting him come with them. She insisted on taking care of him and teaching him manners, even if he pleasured himself in front of them, even if he defecated in front of them. She insisted on continuing to care for Ashoka. Shaky remembers having multiple arguments with Sister Teresa because he wanted to leave Ashoka behind. Still, she insisted on taking him along, and Shaky would always succumb to her demands. And Shaky once again had the same feeling of succumbing when he boarded the cruise ship in the drift fleet with the island delegation, because what the Americans claimed was the truth. They did indeed have a functioning and healthy society aboard their drift fleet. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 3, Issue Number 5, The Snake Has a Reason to Change, and so we're given a glimpse into the life of the Americans. First mate, Miss Dora gives the delegation a tour of their facilities, and we see that they live a life of luxury. Ample chickens in the poultry farm, ample food and dining luxuries aboard the cruise ship as though the outbreak never happened, and ample power to keep the lights running and the hot water flowing. But Shaky notices a few odd peculiarities. The captain is no nowhere to be seen, and Dora averts every question about him. When asked why they need navigation if they simply drift where the water takes them, Dora averts that question too, and distracts the islanders by offering them beer. And just like that, their trip is over without meeting the captain, and without Shaky getting any real answers. As Dora leads them back, Shaky asks about the offshore oil rigging vessel they tow with them, and Dora says they use it for spare parts and storage space. Another fake reply that Shaky doesn't buy. When Shaky reaches the island, he completely understands why Don didn't want any of the islanders to go on the drift fleet. The reason is revealed when Don and Rab talk with Shaky in private. Shaky reveals that every islander would leave the island in a heartbeat if they got a chance to go on the drift fleet, and Rab squints his eyes. Ships sink and islands don't, so they must stay here. However, now their society is at risk because everyone wants to go on the drift fleet. They all reluctantly agree with Don's demand of not letting anyone visit the drift fleet again, and this makes Shaky realize why he was sent with the delegation. It's because he's the snake and the island is his Eden. No matter how much he hates it, no matter how much the islanders hate him, Shaky knows this is his place because nobody else would have him if they knew the real him. However, this perspective shifts instantly when a crying Tabitha comes to his room that night. She has missed her period twice in a row, which could only mean one thing: she is pregnant, and it's Shaky's kid that she carries. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 3, Issue number 6, Death Follows. Shaky is sitting on a boat with Miss Dora while he writes the 37th entry, and she fishes peacefully. Shaky tells us he has been avoiding Tabitha for the past few days, taking every chance to avoid discussing what they should do about the baby. He has been ignoring her and frankly being quite ignorant and dismissive. Tabitha lost her cool and screamed at him to leave her because she planned to do everything independently, and even then, Shaky ignored her. At that moment, he took the boat with Dora out to the sea. While he journaled, she fished. He then tells us the real reason he has been avoiding Dora. It's because everyone he has ever cared for, everyone he has ever taken responsibility for in the past, has always died. We then see the memory of Shaky keeping Ashoke pacified, while Sister Teresa kept an eye on the nearby Crossed until they were gone. Shaky is snapped out of this memory when Dora asks Shaky why he keeps staring at the hills and Hoy Island. Shaky simply says that he is cautious and afraid of the Crossed in the hills, while hiding the truth from her. But he takes this moment to ask Dora why they don't have children on the drift fleet, and she tells him that they have had 3 births on the ship in the past, mostly because the cruise ship was full of old people and the rest were maritime crew. And even those 3 births went horribly. One was stillborn, but the second one survived until its parents decided that the world of the Crossed wasn't for their baby. The parents killed themselves and the baby out of sheer pressure. The last one got fever at a young age and survived, but was left with blindness and damage to the brain. Either way, that baby, the third one, is the only treasure the Americans have. Dora then confesses to Shaky that they all have a lot of sex, but they all use protection because all the Americans have concluded that this new world isn't for kids. They're only condemned to death in this new world. Shaky has heard enough and begins to row back quickly to the island. Tabitha has today's lookout duty, and we see Shaky frantically climbing the lighthouse to reach her. She feels dejected and promises not to nag Shaky anymore, but that is when Shaky apologizes profusely and hugs her tightly. He was waiting to learn about what happens to newborns in this world, and now that he is promising Tabitha that they will find a way to make this pregnancy work. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 3, Issue number 7, The Same as Always. The 38th entry begins, and Shaky tells us that the tension on the island has been palpable. Don and Rab keep the islanders away from all the Americans who have come to trade over the past week, but they know all about the drift fleet through secret whispers. And whenever they come, each islander looks at them longingly, hoping that they will get to sail on a cruise ship and enjoy beer and chicken for the rest of their lives. Shaky and Tabitha are the only ones who keep themselves busy when the trade envoys come to the island. But sadly, even their equation has changed. Shaky was smitten by Tabitha only a few weeks ago, yet the news of pregnancy has changed things for him. However, Tabitha is all-knowing as always. When Shaky expresses this to her, she simply says that romance never sits well with obligation and goes back to her painting. Just like that, she solved Shaky's conundrum in a single sentence. He can't help but admire her for that. He then tells us about the day he tried to to get close to Sister Teresa in bed while she slept, admitting that she used to scooch over to him while she was asleep. However, even that night was interrupted by Ashoka, who jumped on them, thinking they were all playing a game of cuddles. As Shaky looks back, he thinks that Ashoka's actions might have been for the good, because Sister Teresa had woken up startled, as if she didn't know what was happening. Maybe Ashoka inadvertently stopped Shaky from violating her that night. And then their last day of trade is suddenly interrupted by bagpipes, and everyone knows who it is. It's Jackson, and surprisingly, he already knows Dora. In fact, the two seem to be quite friendly with each other when compared to the islanders and Jackson. Jackson apparently was sent out by Dora to survey the island of Flotta, and when Rab and Don try to question them, Dora snorts and says, "No offense, but you guys are very dumb. What you thought we didn't have ulterior motives. It's about the oil, people. It's always about the oil." Shaky tries to tell Dora that the oil terminal on Flotta has unrefined oil, but Jackson rudely tells him to shut up. He doesn't seem to have forgiven Shaky, and what's more is that he found something else on Flotta. He removes the large tarp covering his boat, and underneath is Celine, shaking and trembling with fear, uninfected, but muttering the following words repeatedly: Clay Loan, X, Time and Place. Crossed. Wish You Were Here, Volume 3, Issue number 8, Facism's End. The last entry continues, and Shaky tells us that Celine was housed in the lighthouse just like Boy back in the day. They all pretended that it was to care for her, but in reality, they were worried she might turn into the Crossed soon. Thankfully, that didn't happen, and Maria assured everyone that she had no other traps on herself. Then came the confrontation with Jackson, and he was quite easygoing when he told everyone the entire story. He met the Americans in Durness. They were low on fuel, and there was no wind or current. They would have been stuck there, so Jackson told them about Carver, its survivors, and Flotta. Americans used their last stock of fuel to make their way here. Don screams at Jackson for giving away their location, but Jackson doesn't take kindly to Don's tone. Besides, according to him, survivors are supposed to help each other in these times. The Americans even gave him new pink shoes, something the islanders never did. He then tells them about his time on Flotta and how it is infested with the Crossed. But these Crossed are different. They kept their distance from him, stalked him from the shadows, and when the time was right, they offered him Celine. He found her lying in a circle of lights at night, completely alone and safe. This unnerved Jackson because the Crossed aren't supposed to be smart. They aren't supposed to be organized and rational. He then pulls out an empty envelope that he found on Celine. But before they can get to the envelope, Captain Dora has heard enough, so she decides to execute her plan. She briskly walks outside while Rab and Don rush to stop her, but she pushes them aside and simply calls Shaky to explain things to his leader. Shaky puts two and two together and realizes that their rigging vessel is a portable refinery, so the oil from Flotta will be extremely useful to them. Dora then does the unthinkable and addresses the people of Carver. She tells them that the Americans have been scoping them out for the past few weeks or so because they have plenty of guns while they only have 5 functional ones, and so she makes an offer to them. Any islander who can offer them weapons and some ammo gets to go on the drift fleet. Though Don tries to be insufferable and stop her, Des threatens to break his back if he interrupts her. Once Dora is done, we see everyone looking down at their weapons, contemplating the choice they are about to make. Crossed. Wish You Were Here, Volume 3, Issue number 9, The Most Unexpected Morals. This begins Shaky's 39th journal entry, and he's sitting and writing this beside Celine at night while Maria takes care of her. Shaky tells us that as soon as Miss Dora finished her speech, she was asked to leave, and Rab and Don were furious when she was gone. They didn't say much to her while she was on the island, but were quite vocal upon her departure. A meeting of the close council was quickly held, and it was a heated argument as everyone had expected. Rab and Don were sure that the Americans were planning something hideous, while the rest wanted the freedom for every islander to make their own choice. Things were delving into chaos, and as a society, they were nearing their end. This starkly contrasted how Shaky and Sister Teresa grew closer as they continued to travel. They had begun finishing each other's sentences while taking good care of Ashoka. To prevent the islanders from slipping into utter chaos and mob mentality, Shaky grabbed a chicken and broke its neck to get everyone's attention. attention. All he had said after that was, "One at a time, please." Don quivers in his pants and then proposes the idea of punishing anyone who takes a weapon for themselves. The weapons are the island's property, and anyone who steals them should be punished. Jackson interrupts him and calls him a fascist for taking away people's right to make a choice. Don quips with his own remark about how Jackson has no right to join their internal discussions, and this is when Rab asks what has been on everyone's mind. Why is Jackson helping the Americans? And Jackson's reply is more simple than anyone had expected. He is helping them because they need help, and in a world like this, people should stay together and help each other. This reminds Shaky of Sister Teresa and how she refused to leave Ashok behind no matter what happened. Jackson then says that, in his opinion, they should all leave the island and go with the fleet to help them. But he then leaves the meeting after Don continues calling him an outsider. The same argument continues. Don and Rab paint the Americans as scheming and conniving humans, while everyone else fights for their right to choose. Shaky sighs and instead decides to go after Jackson. He wants to know if Seliani mentioned something else to him when he rescued her, but Jackson refuses to answer and walks away from Shaky. When Shaky insists on an answer, Jackson turns around and punches him in the face. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 3, Issue number 10. Detective Shaky bites his tongue. Shaky continues journaling at the same entry while sitting beside Celine, and we now see that he has a black eye. He tells Maria that he will be there for the big meeting after a few minutes and that they can start without him. As he continues recounting the day, we see that Jackson got mad at Shaky and punched him because Celine did indeed say something else when Jackson rescued her. She told him that all of this was for Shaky. He then tells Shaky that he might not know what that means, but Jackson knows one thing for sure. Shaky is bad news. He is a bad omen. Everyone around him dies, and this is why Jackson wants to keep his distance from him. Shaky then goes and pours his heart out to Tabitha, and she tells him that he's an asshole pretending to be a nice guy, and there's no two ways about it. However, what she says next lifts Shaky's spirits and makes him fall for her even more. Tabitha says, "But I'm also hoping that you're a nice guy pretending to be an asshole pretending to be a nice guy, like a double bluff camouflage, you know?" Shaky then remembers how every time Ashoke created a scene, Sister Teresa would beg him not to call Ashok a liability, something she knew Shaky would do at a moment's notice. Shaky then stops journaling and confronts Celine, who is busy changing Clay Loan X time and date over and over again. When Shaky talks to her, she finally manages to snap out of her trance and tells him the truth about what happened at Fort George. She was treated quite well, unlike Shaky had deduced. The fort's captain had his wife and kids there with him, but things began to go south when the shadow they had encountered in Inverness earlier showed up. The same crossed, dressed from head to toe in black, came to the border of the fort and tossed a crossed baby inside using a sheet of cloth as a trampoline. None of the soldiers realised it then, but two crossed were waiting on the ground with their guns, itching for some skeet shooting practice. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 3, Issue number 11, The Truth of Fort George. The baby was flung into the air and then shot into an explosion of flesh and blood by the waiting Crossed. This had infected some of the soldiers inside, and during this commotion, the captain's wife had fallen down and had broken her arm. Celine had rescued her, and after giving her first aid, she was locked in the bunker to keep the captain's wife safe. They managed to kill the infected soldiers, but this made them miss the 3-hour mark. The captain decided to escort her and the guns out on his own after the meeting time was missed. But before that, he decided to visit his wife one last time. The two of them ended up having sex, but this is when his wife had turned and stabbed him in the back. This is the reason Shaky found the captain with an erection, a black eye, and a black eye. Not because Celine had escaped, but because his wife had turned mid-fornication. She was the one who had rushed out with grenades, and despite being bombarded with bullets by the soldiers, she had managed to blow up the front gates. The Black Shadow had rushed in with the rest of the Crossed and had kidnapped Celine during this commotion. He had then kept her company all night until Shaky and the company had left. And once they were gone, the Shadow had taken Celine to show what Shaky had done. He had taken her to Dolores, who was sitting on the docks and questioning her existence after being left behind by the survivors. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 3, Issue number 12, All for Shaky. And so Dolores and Celine were taken to the standing stones of Stennis by the Shadow, where Eowilian and her followers met them. The Shadow had handed over Shaky's letter, which was addressed to her, and she seemed to have been able to read it. She then kissed the Shadow in approval and offered Dolores to the Crossed. She made Celine watch everything that happened to Dolores, and this made Celine pass out. Celine was then tied up and held captive in a boat, and over the next few days she was conditioned to say only one thing: Clay Loan, X time and place. And when Aoilian had heard Jackson's boat coming, she had set Celine free and handed her a letter for Shaky. That is when she told Celine that all this was being done for Shaky. But when Celine gets to the end of the story, it's as though her brain resets like a computer and she goes back to repeating the message repeatedly. Shaky leaves Celine and goes to meet Don and Rab. The meeting is now over and Don is furious because everyone from the island wants to go on the drift fleet. Shaky dejectedly puts his head down because he knows that just like him, Don and Rab are ready to do anything it takes to save their community. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 3, Issue number 13, The Machinations of Shaky. Shaky begins the 40th entry by telling us that his favourite morning was when he had woken up face to face with Aoilian. Those few moments of eye contact meant everything to him, even though she had closed her eyes and turned away after a few minutes. Today's morning was completely the opposite for him. Gunshots waked him up, and Roshan rushed to his room because a group of Crossed were spotted on the horizon. Sadly, they were hunting down a sortie from the drift fleet, and it was clear that the Americans were quite ill-prepared and unskilled for this job. They had 2 shooters with them. The first fell into the water early on, and the second had an aim that could only be described as pathetic. Jackson, Shaky, Elisa and Des were sent to their rescue by Don and Rab, not out of compassion, but as a favour that they could use in the future. Shaky had used the grenade to blow up the Crossed boat before it reached the Americans, but one of the Crossed had managed to jump into the water. The man in the water was Dave, who had become the surviving Cross's latest prey. Jackson had decided to lead the Americans back to the drift fleet, and Shaky hadn't stopped him for a second. A plan was already hatching in his mind. The Americans hadn't had a Crossed encounter in months. They had very few guns and were quite ill-trained. The Islanders could use this to their advantage, but he will have to be careful how he explains this to everyone. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 3, Issue number 14, Lies and Deception. Shaky's plan is afoot, and upon his behest, Don and Rab made the announcement this afternoon, and it all started in the morning when he managed to get Elisa and Des to help him with his plan. Shaky's plan was simple, making Elisa and Des realise that the drift fleet is open for the taking with no fighting experience, which was easy because, deep down, Shaky knew both of them harboured a dark side. So Don, Rab and Shaky planned out the rest. They used Jackson's morning disappearance to their advantage and claimed to the Islanders that Jackson had revealed what the drift fleet had been planning. They have been scoping the island for weeks and are now getting ready to make the attack. This in fact was a lie, and Don and Rab cover this up by saying that Jackson is a double agent pretending to work with the drift fleet, but his loyalties lie with the Islanders. And this is when Shaky's planning kicks in. The reason for getting Elisa and Des on board with this deception was simple: to make the Islanders believe their lies. After what happened with Jasper, he knew Don and Rab's claims would be doubted, which is why Des and Elisa corroborated what they said after Don and Rab finished. They claimed Jackson told them the same this morning before going with the drift fleet survivors. This is when Shaky remembers how he and Sister Teresa found salvation for the first time when they all came across an abandoned yet intact church. It had been peaceful, and Shaky was about to make his move on Teresa, just like he is about to in the present day. But something happened back then, just like right now. Right now, Tabitha is staring at him, her eyes burning holes in his heart. She is able to see right through his lies, and even back then, a holy moment stopped Sister Teresa from kissing him when she looked at the stained glass window behind him. The glass with Mother Mary's face was cracked, and it had an X on it, just like Sister Teresa, and this holy moment replicates itself in the present, because instead of revealing the truth, Tabitha joins the close council in their lies. She claims Jackson told her the same story last night during her watch duty. So, the Islanders buy the story, and this is when the next phase of Shaky's plan kicks in. He had told Don and Rab what to do once the Islanders believed them. They need to offer them hope, and so Don and Rab do exactly that. They tell the Islanders that now that they know the Americans want oil, they will use this to their advantage and attack first. They will sneak aboard the vessels when everybody's gone to flotter and commandeer the ships for the Crossed. Wish You Were Here, Volume 3, Issue number 15. Some questions are better left unanswered. Shaky's 41st entry in the journal begins 2 days later and the plan is afoot. Des, Elisa and Shaky are rowing to the drift fleet and Elisa once again catches Shaky looking at the hills longingly. She knows he's looking for Ilian, but Shaky avoids this conversation by telling Elisa that she doesn't know what she's talking about. This scene is juxtaposed by Shaky's memory where Sister Teresa is in tears after spotting the X mark on Mother Mary's face. She believes this is a sign for her that God wants to stop her from committing sins. But at that moment, Shaky had given in and confessed his love for her. He had tried to kiss her again, and in this moment of distraction they had forgotten about Ashoka, something he wasn't going to let happen again in the present day. What's more, Sister Teresa was in tears again after his advances, and she simply gave him a friendly pat on the arm and denied his advances. We then see Shaky, Des and Eliza board the drift fleet and they are confronted by Dora, Jackson and the rest of the crew, albeit they are once again mysteriously missing the captain. Shaky lays it out for them. He tells them that none of the islanders want to join them. Jackson is furious at this revelation. He is sure that Shaky must have plotted something, but Shaky simply looks Jackson dead in the eyes and tells him that he is a nomad. He doesn't know anything about life on the island, nor does he know the islanders. This confrontation is juxtaposed by Shaky's memory, where Ashoka ends up finding a medical kit on one of the decomposing corpses in the church. In the present day, however, Shaky manages to get hold of the situation by offering the Americans their old rifles as a sign of good faith, and this allows him to enact the next part of his plan. He asks them when they are going to attack Flotta in order to retrieve the oil, and without hesitation, Dora reveals that they will be going there 2 days later at 7:48 AM, which is awfully precise. And Jackson tells him that his latest reconnaissance of the island has revealed a lot. Shaky tells us through his entries that he wishes he hadn't asked the next question in hindsight, but his curiosity got the better of him and he asked it anyway. He asked Jackson about what he found on Flotta. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 3, Issue number 16, Double Cross. Jackson reveals what he found on Flotta, and although it scares everyone, including Elisa and Des, it only confirms Shaky's suspicions. Jackson found an army of NATO soldiers on Flotta that still patrols the island, keeping the other, Crossed and new groups at bay. They have a routine too. They patrol Flotta and are territorial about it. They spend a day patrolling the stones of Stennis, then the island of Hoy, but after 2 days, they make sure they return to Flotta. And after that, they leave at dawn again and repeat the cycle. This scares Jackson, but what scares him even more is that if the Crossed are following someone, they have been promised a lot of fun in exchange, and he can't even speculate what kind of fun these soldiers have been promised to keep them following this routine. This takes Shaky back to his time with Sister Teresa again. She had decided to stay in the church, but God had other plans, because after she had revealed her decision, Ashoka had grabbed the shotgun and fired it into the ground just for fun. Shaky had knocked him out instantly, but it was already too late. He could hear the Crossed approaching them. Sister Teresa panicked and cried momentarily, but seconds later, she put on her brave face and returned to being her stoic self. They had fought off the Crossed valiantly, albeit Sister Teresa was bad at aiming and she never hit any of them. Shaky reveals this to us, but confesses that he never told Teresa about it. They had dragged Ashoka behind a nearby bush while narrowly approaching the second wave of the Crossed, and they came on scooters. They hid there for hours. Shaky held Ashoka's mouth shut while Teresa hid and kept a close eye on the Crossed until they were gone. Shaky is snapped out of this memory when Jackson finishes and Dora takes over. She tells them that despite all this, they plan to go to Flotta 2 days later, and this is when Shaky figures out their plan. They don't plan to sneak in, they plan to take out the Crossed when they're all gathered in the same place. Dora nods and tells him that they will be using oil in water, Molotov cocktails, and all the ammo at their disposal to make quick work of them. Something crosses Shaky's mind and we know he's scared for Ilian, but he doesn't let his emotions be seen. Instead, he takes his leave and ushers Des and Eliza towards the boat. He shakes Dora's hand one last time and says goodbye, but once he is gone, we see Dora's hand, which has a secret letter from Shaky addressed to her. Another mysterious revelation is the fact that the map behind Dora shows the location of Clay Lone, part of the phrase Celine has been muttering over and over again since she was rescued. Crossed, Wish You Were Here, Volume 3, Issue number 17, Protect What's Important. Shaky's 40-second journal entry begins with the message of protecting what's important, something he is trying to believe, but we will soon see it unravel on its own for him by the end of the comic. 2 days have passed, and the capable islanders selected for the raid wake up 3 hours before dawn to prepare themselves. Don gives them a rousing speech, and though he is lying and he is a prick, he is good with his words. He emphasizes over and over again that they are to feel nothing, that they are to keep guilt out of this equation because it was the Americans that started this, and they are only acting in retaliation. We then see every capable islander boarding the boats while Rab stays behind with the older people and children. Don will be leading this attack, but for some reason, Shaky is bringing Tabitha along. She is apprehensive. What if something happens to her? What if something happens to the baby? Should she tell the others that she is pregnant? But Shaky simply tells her to trust him with every question. He tells her to keep the pregnancy hidden because it would only complicate matters. And though Shaky is forcing himself to believe that he is doing all of this to protect what is important, in reality, this actual message is unraveling and proving itself to be untrue for him through his memories. We see Shaky get agitated and hateful towards Ashoka as the days go on because he is jeopardizing his survival and that of Sister Teresa. And Sister Teresa's refusal to leave him behind only emboldened Shaky to do what he did. As Shaky leads Tabitha and the rest of the islanders on his orchestrated attack based on deception, we see Shaky's memory where he randomly woke up Ashoka in the middle of the night one day and took him for a walk into the woods while Sister Teresa slept. Even back then, Shaky was thinking that he was doing this to protect what was important to him, which was Sister Teresa, in hindsight, and compared to what he is doing to Tabitha in the present, he is beginning to question his own decisions. Crossed, Wish You Were Here, Volume 3, Issue number 18, No Guilt. The 43rd entry begins erratically as Shaky tells us that the raid has ended and it all went downhill. He then recounts all that happened, and we see the islanders boarding the cruise ship without hesitation. Elisa and the rest of them killed and hit the Americans without remorse, while Shaky ensured that Tabitha stayed by his side at all times. They boarded the cruise ship as planned and cut off the bridges that led to the other ships. But this is when Shaky realized something wasn't right. There were too many gunshots being fired at them in retaliation. They were outnumbered. Miranda got her hand shot off while trying to cut off the remaining bridges, and this is when Don concluded that somehow the Americans knew that they were going to attack. When Shaky saw all of his friends going down one by one, he raised his hands and screamed for a ceasefire. For some reason, the Americans complied, and it was then revealed that Captain Dora never left the fleet, nor did her armed men. But Don reveals his devious plan when she orders the islanders to put the guns down. He had ordered Elisa to get the only baby aboard the drift fleet as soon as they were on the ship because it was the Americans' only treasure. We then see Elisa usher in the mother and child at gunpoint, and Dora's heart drops to her stomach. Shaky stammers and tries to stop Don, but Don isn't about to stop now. His true self is out, and this is what he has always been: devious, cunning, ruthless, savage, and remorseless. Elisa forces the mother to give up her child to Don, and Dora watches everything unfold while seething with anger. Don then holds a gun to the infant's head and reveals to Dora that Shaky told them about the child and that it was the only treasure the Americans had. As this happens, Shaky repeatedly scribbles in his journal, saying that this isn't how he had planned for things to go down. Crossed, Wish You Were Here, Volume 3, Issue number 19, You Reap What You Sow. And so the Mexican standoff began, and Don tried asking Dora who gave them up, who was the traitor among the islanders, but she never revealed it was Shaky. She never even looked at him. She simply claimed that they had figured what the islanders would do, and so they had waited for the attack. Words were exchanged, and threats were spewed, but in reality, nobody moved a muscle. They were at an impasse, and Shaky could see the risk evaluation happening behind Dora's eyes. In that moment, he knew she was the real captain, and compared to her, Don was a bumbling idiot. And so Dora revealed her trump card, she called out to Jackson, and the very next second Jackson revealed himself and threw a dagger that hit Don directly in the throat. They hadn't even noticed Jackson. None of them even knew where he was hiding yet. Just like that, it was all over, because it wasn't Don's death that decided their fate. No, it was what happened afterwards. As Don fell over, he lost his grasp on the baby, and then the baby's skull hit the deck. Shaky was too shocked by Jackson's arrival to move in that instant, and they all heard the baby's skull crack, followed by its mother's guttural scream. And this, the baby's death, was what sealed the islanders' fate. The guilt finally got to them, and none of them had the heart to pull the trigger, even though the element of surprise was on their side. They all simply stood there motionless, and it was Dora who snapped them all out of their daze. She ordered them to put their guns down, and they all did as they were told. Shaky tried to confess to Dora that none of them knew that Don would do this, but she shut him up instantly. She was too good, and even at that moment she was working to uphold the deal Shaky had offered her through his letter. But first, she needed to be true to her crew, so she asked the mother, Marcy, what she wanted in revenge. And Marcy wanted Elisa's life, and so Dora granted her request without a hint of remorse in her eyes. In an instant, Dora aimed her pistol at Elisa and blew her brains out. Shaky thought that was the end of it all, but Dora had other plans. She still had to uphold her deal with Shaky, and so she took Tabitha as hostage, took their guns, and ordered them never to return, else they would kill Tabitha. In reality, Shaky knew what was happening, and as Tabitha looked back at him one last time, he hoped she could see through his lies again. This wasn't how he had intended for this to happen, but this was the conclusion he had wanted for her. He had betrayed them all. He had betrayed his home Carver to buy Tabitha and his child a new and better life on the Drift Fleet. Thankfully, Dora had granted that, but the cost might come creeping up on Shaky someday. We then see Dora kick the islanders off her fleet and order them never to return, or she will kill every last one of them. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Vol 3, Issue number 20, Tiny Mistakes, Massive Consequences. And so the islanders began their journey back towards Carver, while being led by Jackson, who stared at Shaky every chance he got, and Shaky averted his eyes every time. Shaky saw hatred in his eyes, of course, but maybe a hint of respect as well. This confirmed to Shaky that Jackson knew about the deal, and maybe understood why Shaky did what he did to ensure a better future for Tabitha and his child. Shaky protected what was important to him, but this notion of protecting what was important takes him back to when he had led Ashoka into the woods while Sister Teresa was asleep. Something Shaky is ashamed of to this day. Shaky's habit of keeping an eye on the hills every chance he gets finally pays off. He spots a group of humanoid figures on the hills and urges Jackson to look through his rifle's scope. Jackson aims, but instead of surveying the scene, he takes the shot. Shaky's memory continues on the next page, and we see him leave Ashoka in the woods under the pretext of playing a game. But when Shaky leaves, we see remorse and regret in his eyes, and we know Shaky left him there for good. He never intended to return to him again, and this is juxtaposed by Shaky asking Jackson if he shot her, if he shot Aoilian, and a perplexed Jackson hands Shaky the rifle and asks him to take a look himself. Shaky aims down the sights and sees what he has been suspecting all this while. This revelation is juxtaposed by the image of Ashoka sitting alone in the woods. Shaky sees that the shadow figure stopped Jackson's shot at Aoilian. He had jumped in front of her to protect her, and right now Aoilian is removing his mask. It is revealed that the shadow figure was a crossed Ashoka, and this is juxtaposed by Ashoka sitting alone in the woods trying to cheer himself up by remembering his happy memories with Sister Teresa and Shaky. The memory continues, and we see Shaky convince Sister Teresa that Ashoka might have gone out on his own in the night, and that they shouldn't look for him because they would be risking their own lives. They should keep moving on, and Sister Teresa reluctantly agreed with Shaky. This memory, however, is juxtaposed by an angry Aoilian and her soldiers staring back at Shaky and the islanders. Shaky is horrified by this revelation, and he knows what they have done will cost them dearly. He hands the rifle back to Jackson without saying a word to any of them, but his journal entries tell us that at that moment he knew something big was coming for him, for all of them, and they were about to pay for all of their crimes. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 3, Issue number 21, Needs Satisfied. Upon reaching Carver, Jackson punches Rab for his dirty plan, and Rab takes it like a man. After all that has happened, Rab knows he deserved that. We see all the islanders outside the cabin, desperately trying to listen to the exchange between the two, and this is contrasted by Shaky's memory of him and Sister Teresa surviving on their own in the wild. She would regularly ostracize herself for committing sins, while Shaky would regularly Shaky, challenge and debate about her faith, but all she could tell him in return was that there was nothing wrong in being the best version of yourself. God is nothing but conscience. Back in the present day, Jackson is having a heart-to-heart with Rab for old time's sake, and it's confirmed that the two knew each other before the outbreak began. Jackson is telling Rab about Shaky and his connection to the crossed nun in the hills that they have all come to fear. He knows she's here for him, and even now, Jackson knows Shaky is listening to them, but he doesn't care. The truth is, they can't predict what the nun will do, and neither can Shaky. As much as he knows about her and their past connection, he knows nothing about her future plans, which scares him the most, and so he is demanding Rab to kill her the first chance he gets. According to Jackson, she is the one controlling all the crossed, and once she is gone, they will return to being their predictable selves, and life will become much easier for the survivors once again. This is juxtaposed by Shaky's argument about God owning Sister Teresa's body back in the day. Why would God care about her body, her physical relations with someone? And this memory is abruptly interrupted by Celine's loud voice, who seems to have snapped out of her daze after listening to the conversation between Jackson and Rab. She reveals to all of them that the nun isn't leading the crossed, but instead holding them back, and she is only holding them back for Shaky's sake. This revelation is juxtaposed by Shaky and Sister Teresa's first kiss, and Celine continues to reveal all she knows about Aoilian. She tells the islanders that even though she holds them back, she's human after all, and she gets angry sometimes, like the other crossed. And when that happens, she is forced to satisfy her anger just like the other crossed, and at times she is forced to throw them a bone in order to keep them in check. Rab doesn't understand what she is trying to say, and so Celine simply points towards the horizon and tells Rab that the sun is setting twice today for a reason. They all look towards the horizon, and even though it's the middle of the night, they see a large orange glow that resembles a sunset, and then it hits them that the orange glow is coming from the direction of the drift fleet. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 3, Issue number 22, Past Shadowed by the Present. Shaky scribbles the 45th entry in the journal hurriedly because he doesn't have much time. He tells us that all of the able-bodied islanders mobilized when they saw the orange glow coming from the direction of the drift fleet. Shaky, Des, Skip, and Jackie headed in that direction while Jackson led them. But instead of taking a boat, they were going by foot, and when they reached the hills, they saw that the Crossed had destroyed the entire fleet, and all Shaky could take solace in was the fact that he never spotted Tabitha, thankfully, through all of it. He blamed himself for dumping her at the fleet and thought that this was God's twisted way of exacting revenge on him for all he had done. What hit the worst was the fact that this revenge was enacted through the hands of Aoilian, because all of them saw her deboarding from the main cruise liner while being flanked by her chosen ones. One of the soldiers tossed a mysterious black bag into her boat, and all of these unanswered questions finally got to Jackson. He broke his vow of staying away from Shaky and demanded answers from him. He wanted to know who the nun was and how she was connected to Shaky. This question juxtaposes what happened after Shaky and Sister Teresa's kiss. She was conflicted by what she had done, forcing her to go into the woods and away from Shaky to reflect on her actions. This is when, in the present day, Shaky finally gives in and tells the islanders that the nun is her fault. She is his mistake. The islanders watch as the soldiers lead the nun, aka Aoilian, in her decorated boat towards the nearby shore. She then orders the soldiers to return while heading into the island alone. This is contrasted by Shaky's memory and him getting to his feet when Sister Teresa hadn't come back for a while. When he had gone into the woods to check on her, he had found her sitting under a large rock while a crossed woman armed with a knife loomed over her. In the present day, Jackson decides to hunt down Aoilian on his own because she is all alone. He demands to know who is the best shot among the islanders, and after Elisa's death, Shaky's is the best one. He reluctantly decides to go along with Jackson on the hunt, while telling us that maybe it's about time he confronted his past. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 3, Issue number 23, Doing What Needs to Be Done. We continue the story with Shaky's memory where Sister Teresa is hiding under a rock while a Crossed is hunting for her on the ground above. Her sobs are drawing the Crossed closer, and Shaky is holding off from shooting it in case the blood splatter ends up infecting Teresa. However, that is when things get dire because Sister Teresa begins to suffer from a fit at that moment. Back in the present day, we see Shaky hold Jackson responsible for the the attack on the Drift Fleet because he was the one who shot at Aurelian, and Jackson doesn't argue about it. Back in the memory, we see Sister Teresa's fit had given her position away, and Shaky was forced to shoot the Crossed before it got to her. Unfortunately, what he hadn't even thought about happened in the very next second. Other Crossed in the area have heard the gunshot and are now running towards their location. Back in the present day, Shaky is scouting through the thermal scope while Jackson is looking for tracks on the ground. Shaky sees a humanoid figure rise up from behind a rock, hears a gunshot, and sees a flash in the thermal scope. Shaky puts down the scope and kills the Crossed that ambushed them, but when he looks at Jackson, he realizes that the shot wasn't meant for him. It was meant for Jackson, who has been shot in the torso and can't feel his legs anymore. This is it. Jackson's fate has been sealed. He can't walk, and the gunshot would have alerted the Crossed from the boat. These dire circumstances are contrasted by Shaky's memory, where he held Sister Teresa in his arms for more than 8 hours while the Crossed hunted them. His luck again came to his rescue, and his camouflage under the leaves proved capable of keeping them hidden. Once all of them had gone, and once Sister Teresa's fit was over, she had slept in his arms out of exhaustion. But Shaky tells us through his journal entries that he swears between those moments he heard her thank him through a whisper. Shaky in the present day is pointing the gun at Jackson, but he can't do it. He can't bring himself to kill Jackson, so Jackson does what he does best, and he antagonizes Shaky. He tells Shaky that he knows about all the settlements in the area. He knows about all their secrets. He is even aware of the hidden weapon caches around the islands, and if there's one thing Shaky should fear more than Aurelian, it's Jackson turning into the Crossed and hunting him for years to come. Shaky understands, but if there's one thing he has learned in the past few days, it's that he doesn't want a dirty conscience. So instead of shooting Jackson himself, he holds up the other rifle and walks up to Jackson. Crossed Wish You Were Here. Volume 3, Issue number 24, Worst Nightmare. And so, with Jackson practically dead, Shaky hands over Jackson his rifle with only one bullet in the chamber. Jackson knows what he is supposed to do. He wishes he was born on Jupiter, puts the rifle in his mouth, and pulls the trigger. Shaky then tells us about the past, and that when Sister Teresa woke up after her fit, their love for each other blossomed, and they finally kissed. We then see a horrified Shaky stare at Jackson, pay his respects to the man, then pick up Jackson's rifle and leave. This scene of Shaky leaving Jackson's body behind is juxtaposed by the scene of Shaky making his move on Sister Teresa back in the day. We then catch up with Shaky in the present and realise that after leaving Jackson behind at night, Shaky has been journaling while keeping an eye on the ground below. He is on a cliff and the sun is about to rise over the horizon. He has followed the path Jackson showed him, and he is bound to intersect with Aurelian at any moment now. And then, when Shaky stares in the valley below, he sees her. She is carrying the same mysterious sack that was thrown into the boat by one of the soldiers, and when Shaky turns away for a moment, she vanishes into thin air. Intrigued by this entire course of events, Shaky decides to get down into the valley and follow in her footsteps. But when he reaches the location, he hears a familiar voice, a voice he had never expected to hear again. He hears the gamekeeper's voice, and he says, "Who goes there? Never a minute's fucking peace." The gamekeeper is alive. He is missing an arm, an eye, and a leg, but is alive nonetheless. He holds up a gun in the vague direction of Shaky as a cave looms in the background, and at his feet is the same mysterious sack that Aurelian was carrying. It is filled to the brim with food cans, and this revelation that the gamekeeper is still alive is juxtaposed by Shaky's memory of him making love to Sister Teresa. Crossed Wish You Were Here. Volume 4, Issue number 1, Shaky's Obsession with Climax. This is the 46th entry, and it begins by showing Shaky desperately running away from the gamekeeper's location. He is carrying 2 rifles, but that doesn't matter to him. He has just seen a ghost and wants to escape it immediately. Shaky is talking about things reaching critical mass, and the next page shows us that he dropped his pen in a hurry to leave the gamekeeper's location. That was the moment he reached critical mass. Just like back then, when he and Sister Teresa were making love, he was about to reach critical mass, so to speak, but she stopped him midway because a crossed gardener was right above them. Even though he had wanted to stop, he had stared into Sister Teresa's eyes for confirmation. We then see Shaky reach Jackie, Skip, and Des, and by the look on his face, we see that the rest of the islanders already know what became of Jackson. They all row back to the island, and we then see Shaky journaling under his sheepskin while being protected from rain, as he confesses that it has been several days since these events transpired, but he has just now found the time and heart to journal. We then see that his lovemaking session was quite anticlimactic with Sister Teresa because the presence of the Crossed had turned her off, and Shaky's insistence on carrying on once the Crossed had gone hadn't helped his cause. She had pushed him off of her and had continued the journey while apologizing to her god. This is juxtaposed with Skip, Des, Jackie, and Shaky reaching the island. Instead of a warm welcome, they are greeted by the islanders preparing for an attack. At first, Shaky suspects that Rab has finally turned on him, but then he sees Rab pointing behind them, and Shaky turns around to see the cruise ship full of crossed Americans headed for Carver. Dora, Sean, and everyone else are hungry for their blood, and according to Shaky, his world also seems to have reached critical mass. Crossed Wish You Were Here. Volume 4, Issue Number 2, Just Reacting. The comic starts by showing us the cruise ship about to crash into the shore as the islanders do everything they can to prepare for the imminent attack. The beach has been drenched in oil, every capable human is armed to the teeth, and Molotov cocktails are ready. Yet, Shaky's entries tell us that despite the preparation, they could only react in retaliation when the chaos began. We see the Crossed jump into the water when the cruise ship beached itself, while Mark and Christine desperately pour oil into the pipeline. Once they were close enough, and enough of the Crossed were in range, Rab gave the order and Skip tossed the first Molotov. The first wave burned to a crisp, but there were too many of them. Des, Skip, Shaky, and Jamie did their best to hold the next waves back, but they kept coming with no sign of stopping. Shaky tried to burn their ladders but missed widely, and instead, the Molotov landed near the Crossed captain Dora. She smirked, and in retaliation killed Christine. This forced them all to double their efforts, but Shaky knew they needed to change their strategy. So when Rab refused to take charge, Shaky stepped up and told everyone to pull back. Rab backed him up. Their only chance at surviving now lay deeper in the island away from Eden because it had been lost to the Crossed. The Calf of Carver, the space where they retreated to each night, the safest spot on the island, had now been turned into the most dangerous one. Shaky threw a grenade and gave the islanders enough time to make their escape. He could have escaped too, but he needed to get something from his quarters. He knew he had dropped his pen and he needed a replacement, but when he got inside, he found much more than he had bargained for. He found an infected Tabitha going through his stuff. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 4, Issue Number 3, Comeuppance. We pick up where we left off, but this time Shaky isn't surprised by Tabitha's presence. Instead, she is. Despite being infected, Tabitha gets a weird feeling in her stomach when she discovers that Shaky kept the portrait she drew of him when they first met. When Tabitha realized he was still in the room, she looked at him with disgust, but all Shaky could do was ask about their baby. This is juxtaposed with the moment Sister Teresa finds a live human baby walking through the streets of a seemingly abandoned town. Shaky hadn't believed her at first, but when he had looked through the binoculars himself, it had turned out to be the truth. Somehow, after all these months, a human baby had managed to survive and was freely roaming the streets of the town amidst all the chaos and destruction. This memory is cut off by the infected Tabitha confronting Shaky, but the very next second, she is shot down by a panicked Mark who comes to Shaky's rescue. But this isn't what Shaky wanted. He wanted to talk to Tabitha, and so without a second's thought, Shaky shoots Mark in the head and blows his brains to smithereens. But it's already too late. Tabitha has passed away, and so Shaky does what he is good at. He sighs, gathers his thoughts, and focuses on the task at hand. Pen. He grabs a replacement pen from his things, and then walks back towards the survivors like a zombie. Amina Masood, Roshan's mother, is behind him, about to be overrun by the Crossed, but by the time Shaky snaps out of his daze, it's too late. She succumbs to the Crossed, while her husband and daughter scream for her as Shaky approaches the razor wire. He continues walking like a zombie and simply sits down while helping the rest shoot the Crossed as soon as they are in range. Shaky and Celine sit on the ground, facing away from the action, as though signifying they both have had enough. It doesn't matter whether they win, but then again, it seems that luck has given up on Shaky after all this time, because although they managed to defeat the Crossed from the cruise ship by evening, they turn around to find 3 more ships full of the infecteds headed for Carver. Shaky hears Rab say what he had never expected the old man to say in this lifetime. Rab tells everyone that they need to leave Carver. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 4, Issue Number 4, Free Captives. And so, with dejected looks, the islanders get into their rowboats and prepare to leave Carver. Except this time, Mr. Masood has reached his limit. He can't take it anymore, so he decides to stay back while Rab and Shaky usher Roshan into the boat while she screams for her father. This is when Shaky recounts that he had brought back 3 claymores from his sortie. One was used when Jasper was killed, and they were now left with only one, because the second one was with Mr. Masood. And we then see Mr. Masood trigger the mine once most of the Crossed are in range. The islanders watch their home on cover go up in flames once again as they look at it longingly from far away. This juxtaposes Shaky and Sister Teresa's argument about the child they just found. Shaky knows the child will be a liability, but Sister Teresa wasn't just about to leave a child alone. This moment shows how detached Shaky has become, because he keeps referring to the child as an it, and Sister Teresa has to remind him that it's a her. As they continue to explore the nearby church, suspecting that the child must have come from there, they hear the sound of praying coming from the top of the bell tower, and this memory is interrupted when Skip spots multiple boats headed for the islanders, and they all seem to be coming from Hoy. It's the Crossed soldiers, and they are being led by a Crossed from Aurelian's inner circle, the old man with a black hooded robe. He pulls back his robe to reveal himself, juxtaposed by the memory of what Shaky and Sister Teresa found at the top of the bell tower. They found Reverend Moses White caring for a group of kindergartners, and the man under the black hood is also Reverend White. In the memory, the Reverend welcomed Shaky and Sister Teresa. He also thanked them for finding Carmel, who seemed to have run away on her own while he was out to get supplies. However, in the present, Reverend White is ordering the islanders to go back to Carver, or else he and his army would kill them all this very instant. He somehow controls his urges and is smarter than the rest. The islanders are shocked by this confrontation, but the choice is simple, so Rab orders everyone to turn around moments later. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 4, Issue Number 5, What is Home? And so reluctantly, we see the islanders turn back and prepare themselves to take back what was once their home. Even Maria and the rest of the old people have armed themselves, and so on the next page we see the assault begin. They start by clearing off the beach from the distance, and then Rab, Des and Shaky lead the charge back into the island. They manage to hold the Crossed back valiantly, but end up losing Edith, Christine's twin sister, in the process, who gets infected due to blood splatter. The islanders continue to hold the Crossed back, while Shaky kills Edith once she has turned. This is juxtaposed by Reverend White's memory of welcoming Shaky and Sister Teresa by offering them whiskey, which seems to have become his coping method after the outbreak. Shaky sips on the whiskey as the Reverend tells them his story. He used to run a daycare in the church when the outbreak began, and that is how he ended up caring for all these children. They simply retreated into the bell tower and have stayed here for all these months. The Reverend goes on supply runs every week or so, because plenty of supplies are left in the town, but not many people. We then see Sister Teresa smile for the first time after the incident. She is finally happy over the next few days as she cares for the children and teaches them about life. We then catch up with Shaky in the present as he sits under his sheepskin to avoid the pouring rain. This is when he began journaling this last entry, and around him, the rest of the islanders were busy containing the Crossed bodies and setting up the tents. They have won, but the cost has been too high. Shaky holds up the sealed envelope that Jackson found on Celine as he contemplates finally giving in and talking with Aurelian. He knows Clay Lone is the location on Hoy Island. X likely refers to him, and time and place might be her way of giving Shaky the chance to make his own call regarding the meeting. As night comes, Shaky inspects his surroundings and realizes that the entire island of Carver is now their prison. Aurelian's Crossed army surrounds them, and they are making no effort to remain hidden because everyone can see lights on all sides of the island in the dark. This is contrasted by Shaky's memory of him making plans to move on with Sister Teresa. She had simply touched him under the chin and confessed that she planned to stay with the Reverend and the children. This is juxtaposed by Rab saying what everyone has been thinking since dusk. Carver, the island that was once their home, had now become their prison. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 4, Issue Number 6, Why Bother? This would be Shaky's 47th entry in his journal, but he no longer keeps count. This entry has the theme brink of humanity, as Shaky tells us that everyone on the island is strained, not physically, but mentally. He tells us that they have tried starting life from scratch, which is apparent by Shaky journaling on the beached cruise ship while simultaneously catching fish. We then see the islanders burning and burying Crossed bodies while covering covering their skin as best as possible. And then, Shaky tells us that Skip and his family were the first ones to do what they all were itching to. They were the first ones to betray them all and try to escape. Skip had escaped with his yacht's engine and his family in the middle of the night, using the only motorboat they had, and ominously returned the next morning with Lance, but without Jackie. Everyone called them a traitor, but when Lance doubled down and puked his guts out as soon as he touched land, everyone knew that karma had already hit them. Skip tried to justify his actions by telling them all that they would have returned for the islanders with the yacht, but nobody believed him. They all knew his story and how he had left his injured and disabled brother behind. We then learn what had happened to Jackie. The yacht was trapped and a Crost was stationed on it. As soon as the family had gotten close, Jackie was struck with a harpoon in the leg and pulled away. Skip's recounting of events is interrupted by Celine, who tells them that something horrible is taking place on the shore. They all walk outside to discover the Reverend and the rest of the Crost violating Jackie on Skip's yacht as a sign of defiance and the islanders' subservience. They make a display out of it, and all the islanders can do in retaliation is seethe with anger. Shaky covers Lance's eyes and ears to prevent him from the trauma, because once the Crost were done with Jackie, they burned her along with Skip's yacht right in front of their eyes, signifying the loss of any hope of escape that the islanders might have had. What's worse is when Lance tries to hug his father Skip, Skip simply disowns him. It turns out that Skip wasn't Lance's real father, and he married Jackie when Lance was 2 years old. The brink of humanity, they all had finally reached their breaking point, and so Shaky did the only thing he knew. He looked at Rab, held up the empty envelope from Aoilian, and said that they needed to finally act on what they had been pushing away. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 4, Issue number 7, Buried Secrets. The comic begins by showing us the memory of Shaky and Sister Teresa's time with Reverend White. A few days after their arrival, the Reverend was planning a supply run to the nearby store when Sister Teresa had a fit once again. This is juxtaposed by Shaky and Des leaving the island to finally fill the empty envelope sent by Aoilian and maybe get some sort of a resolution to their current conundrum. Des's daughter tried stopping him, but he coldly refused her and ordered her to stay back. This scene is contrasted by the memory of Reverend White using the Bible to keep Sister Teresa from swallowing her tongue and taking care of her. But all Shaky could feel at that moment was envy. He was envious of the Reverend because he got to take care of Teresa and not Shaky. We then see Shaky and Des easily bypass the Crossed by showing the empty envelope, and Des isn't affected by the smart Crossed one bit. This once again made Shaky feel envious. He was envious of Des's confidence. Juxtaposing this moment is the memory of Sister Teresa waking up from her fit and Reverend White offering her some whiskey. Even though she doesn't drink and hasn't tried it in the past, despite Shaky offering it numerous times, Sister Teresa gives in this time when Reverend White makes the same argument that Shaky usually makes. Why would a God that loves you stop you from doing things you love? Shaky was seething and angry at that moment because Teresa had her first drink with Reverend White. We then see Des and Shaky walk through Clay Lone and find a house with a huge X marked on top of it. The message is clear, and when they head inside, they find the following message scrawled on the wall in blood above a Chester: Standing Stones of Stenness. When Shaky knows that he needs to write down a time for Aoilian because she has already given him the location, he rips out a piece of paper, writes down the time and date as tomorrow at noon, and then hands it to Des, who already has the open envelope. Des places the paper in it, licks the envelope and seals it. Shaky places it on the Chester, but that is when Des claims that the paper is weirdly salty and starts acting strange. He begins to panic for the first time on this trip and confesses his deepest secret to Shaky. Chanice isn't his only child. He had a son named Isaac, who he left behind when escaping the Crossed. Everything he has done till date dawns on him, leaving Isaac behind. Treating Chanice poorly because he didn't have a son anymore, abusing Sophia, everything comes back to him. His voice then changes, and a crossed rash appears on his face, and as Des reaches for his gun, Shaky points his at Des's head. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 4, Issue number 8, The Long-Awaited Confrontation. And so we see Shaky shoot Des in the head because he had been turned. The envelope was infected and intended for Shaky, but once again, his luck had saved him. But people around him had died again. Shaky walks out of the house and rows back to Carver in a daze while contemplating every memory and trying to find answers. When he reaches Carver, he simply walks away as Chanice looks up at him for answers, and Rab again notices that Shaky has returned alone. This is contrasted by Shaky's memory of the morning after Sister Teresa's first night of drinking. Sister Teresa had woken up naked and her lingerie was nowhere to be found. In the present day, Shanice is coming to terms with her father's death, and this is juxtaposed by Reverend White finding the lingerie in his pockets with no memory of ever having taken it. What's peculiar is the fact that Shaky was the one to point the finger at him, and as Shaky spends a few hours in his tent and then leaves for the Stones of Stennis without talking to anyone, we see that despite all that happened, Teresa has forgiven Reverend White and has returned to drinking with him. This angered Shaky even more, and it was clear that he had tried framing the Reverend. We then see Shaky arrive at the Stones, but no one is there. Then a voice from a radio gets his attention, and he already knows who it is. It's the voice of the gamekeeper. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 4, Issue number 9, peeling the first layer of the onion, and so the gamekeeper begins to unravel the truth to Shaky while taking every chance he gets to taunt and mock him. Through some miracle, even though Shaky had set the alarm to off after every hour, none of the Crossed ever came for the gamekeeper after Shaky tied him to a tree and left him for dead. Instead, Ashoke found him a few days later, and by that time, one of his eyes had already been plucked by a crow. He then tells Shaky that he tracked down Sister Teresa to the church, but by that time she and Reverend White had already been infected and were days ahead of him in the north. Shaky doesn't want to reveal what happened at the church, and the gamekeeper doesn't care about it. He wants to get to the end of his narration before the radio's battery runs out. He tells Shaky that Oilian and Reverend joined a group of NATO soldiers who had also been infected. She was weak and useless, so nobody paid much attention to her except the Reverend, and so she used this to her advantage, gathered supplies, dressed herself better, and then tested her theory when the Crossed found a group of survivors a few days later, camping in the middle of nowhere. Even after being infected, Oilian was smart, and because she was at the back, she could see the trap laid out by the survivors, and so she issued her first order. Wait, genius really. The ones that listened got to survive and believe in her. The ones that didn't fall into the trap and aided in the evolution of the Crossed. Half of the group gets blown up by the trap, while the rest attack the survivors. This is when she issued her second set of orders to them, to be slower, to prolong the torture for maximum gratification. And then her third order came when she recognized the pattern of the Crossed. We all know the Crossed go into a stupor, a sort of daze when there is nothing to torture and kill for days. She used this to her advantage. She started by associating this state with the word boring and kept repeating it repeatedly, and soon the other Crossed followed her lead. And so when they found their next group of survivors, she reminded them of boring during the attack, and it worked. The Crossed tortured and kept the survivors alive for 2 weeks. During this conversation, there is a weird tone of reverence in the gamekeeper's voice, as though he has begun to worship Oilian. This is highly contrasted by every image of Reverend White, who seems to carefully observe and study Oilian during every attack. By the time the gamekeeper found them, the Crossed had already learned that it was best to listen to Oilian because she fulfilled the promise of extreme gratification, and so she had become their de facto leader. We see that by this time she had pieced together the black suit we saw Ashoke wearing when he was killed, and she initially wore it. Oilian ordered her men to capture the gamekeeper and Ashoke, but they didn't follow her orders all the way through. They infected Ashoke immediately, and Oilian barely managed to prevent the gamekeeper from becoming prey. Reverend White had bit the gamekeeper's leg, and Oilian had cut it in an instant to keep the infection from spreading. At first, it seemed she wanted to save the gamekeeper, but what she did next only established her dominance over the Crossed and made it clear that the gamekeeper was there to be tortured. Because Oilian had ordered Reverend White to pleasure her with the gamekeeper's amputated leg, and even the Crossed had gone silent for a moment after hearing that. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 4, Issue number 10, Mysteries That Were Ignored. The gamekeeper continues his story and tells Shaky that after that day, Reverend White had lost all the respect that he held among the Crossed group, and all this while, none of them knew that Oilian was leading them to Shaky and Carver. She already knew where he was. The letters weren't needed. Shaky then realizes she must have remembered when he had first mentioned Carver to her while they were at the church. When Shaky was out on a smoke break, he met Maria and John John, who had told him about Carver. Again, the gamekeeper tells Shaky to be quiet because he isn't interested in his part of the story. The gamekeeper's behavior is odd. It's as though he is scared of hearing Shaky's side of the story. He then tells Shaky that Arwilian and her group observed the islanders from afar for months. She kept her group satisfied by letting them torture and kill any stragglers while promising them a bigger event, a grand event that they were all preparing for. The gamekeeper laughs as he concludes that she is once again selling religion even after being infected. He then tells Shaky that all the mysteries like the cow in the dinghy or the crossed on the nearby island were little traps from Arwilian, to see the islanders' reaction, to judge their wit, but mostly to see Shaky's face. However, during this time, Reverend White was scheming and planning a rebellion, but Arwilian was too smart for him. She caught him before he could get too many soldiers on his side and nipped the rebellion in the bud thanks to her faithful soldiers. It again worked in her favour because those with the will to dissent or not enough control to listen to her were now dead, but for some reason she kept the Reverend. The gamekeeper then tells Shaky that the crossed don't like killing their own because the ones being killed have too much fun. Arwilian also turned this around by teaching her group to see it in a different light, to see it not as fun but as a victory over the one you've just killed, and that they need to mark their kill by carving an X on their face. This Arwilian's another way of spitting on the gamekeeper. We then see her soldiers carving X's on the rebels, nailing them to wooden crosses and raising them on Hoy. And this is when her group began to form a routine, a functioning society. They started using new crossed as food and fodder for fun. The ones that were a bit smart were amputated and used as human alarms. This is when we see her leaving a mutilated crossed in Skip's yacht. There is an undertone of appreciation when the gamekeeper recounts all that Arwilian managed to accomplish during this time, and Shaky confronts him about it. Shaky knows that the gamekeeper is in love with her. The gamekeeper aggressively changes the topic and tells Shaky that she was furious when he went on the sortie. She panicked for the first time since she was infected, and Shaky could hear the tone of jealousy in the gamekeeper's voice. We learn that Reverend White tried to stage another coup during this time. He and his men were the ones to use mortars on Skip's yacht, and Arwilian saved them in the nick of time. She killed all the soldiers that supported him, but once again kept the Reverend alive. We then see her give the gamekeeper's protective suit to Ashoka and send him out to follow Shaky and to ensure his survival. And this is when we see tears streaming down the gamekeeper's cheeks while his eyes are hidden as he says to Shaky, "You know what I think, Shakespeare? I think that she thinks you're God." Crossed, Wish You Were Here, Volume 4, Issue number 11, The Big Fun. The gamekeeper reveals that Arwilian had begun calling the promised big event to her disciples as the Big Fun, and while Shaky was gone on the sortie, two things happened. The first was Reverend White's yet another act of rebellion by staging an attack on the gamekeeper, but the gamekeeper had survived it by knocking out the Reverend and then by amputating his own hand to prevent the spread of infection. He had then carved an X on the Reverend's chest to assert his dominance, which made him sort of a boogeyman in the eyes of most of the crossed. However, Arwilian had one-upped him and the Reverend by forcing the Reverend to use the amputated arm to pleasure her while the gamekeeper watched. This time, the gamekeeper ensures to inform Shaky that the Reverend wasn't able to make Arwilian climax both times. The second thing that happened while Shaky was on the sortie was that Arwilian and her group discovered Jasper and a group of innocent survivors. He was feeding them tales of the sanctuary on Carver when Arwilian and her soldiers ambushed them. The survivors were killed and the shock of it all had made Jasper defecate himself. Arwilian knew how she could use a man like Jasper to her advantage, which is why she had set him free and he had scrambled away instantly. That night she was hailed and crowned as their leader by the crossed. It is the same night Shaky and Viceroy had seen her getting a staple gun used on her face with her arms spread out wide. It was her coronation, and the next day Arwilian sentenced the gamekeeper to a life of solitude in a nearby cave. But that is when things changed once again. Shaky and the rest returned to Carver, and Ashoka came back with Selena and Shaky's letter. Shaky then notices something else. Every time the gamekeeper gamekeeper mentions Aoilian, he calls her a bitch, but every time he calls her a bitch, for some mysterious reason, he apologizes. And we then see that Shaky's letter gave Aoilian the idea of replying to Shaky. That is the day she began breaking down Celine's psyche and left the crate of infected ammo out on the beach for Jasper to find. That night, during the confrontation between Shaky and Jasper, she was worried for him. She was worried, but when she saw through the binoculars that Shaky had survived, she waved back at him with his letter in hand. And this is when Shaky realizes that he had misinterpreted this gesture when he had seen her through Jasper's thermal scope. After this, more and more soldiers began believing in her promise of the big fun, and it finally arrived in the form of the Americans and the Drift Fleet. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 4, Issue number 12. Trying to sound important, the gamekeeper is nearing the end of his story, and he grows frantic with each passing second because Shaky knows most of the events that have happened after that. He knows about Jackson finding Celine, and he knows about what happened in their next encounter. When the gamekeeper refuses to answer why he keeps apologizing every time he calls Aoilian a bitch, Shaky asks the next big question: why is she keeping him alive? The gamekeeper laughs and tries to sound profound by hoping that she is keeping Shaky alive to infect him when the time is right. But Shaky knows that even he doesn't know the answer to that question, and this is proven when the gamekeeper tries to regain control of the conversation by blaming Shaky for what is happening with the Crossed and Aoilian right now. You see, because she was holding back the Crossed from attacking the Drift Fleet for weeks by promising the big fun, she was slowly losing control, and the Reverend was gaining power and more followers. And the power shifted when Shaky killed Ashoke. Well, he didn't, but he was the one who pointed him out to Jackson. The Crossed rallied behind the Reverend, and he led the attack on the Drift Fleet. And Aoilian hated this. Even though she regained control over her disciples during the fight, she hated losing control for a moment, all because she was angry about Ashoke's death. And this anger was taken out on the gamekeeper that day. When she visited him with food, she came close to killing him, but then simply left without speaking another word. Shaky knows this because he was there that night, and the gamekeeper knows he was there because he found Shaky's pen. So, to regain control over her disciples, she gave the Reverend a task: keeping Shaky and the Islanders contained on Carver. This is why Reverend White stopped Shaky and the Islanders from escaping when they were attacked by the recently turned Crossed from the Drift Fleet. It was a win-win situation. The recently turned Crossed were a problem for Aoilian as well, and she knew the Islanders could kill them all. What's more is that if the Reverend succeeded in his job, then he would still be her slave, and if he failed and staged an attack on the Islanders, then he would surely be killed during the assault. Either way, Aoilian was going to get her power back. This revelation reminds Shaky of the time he had tried to convince Sister Teresa to go with him to Carver because it was safe there, and this makes him ask the gamekeeper the most pertinent question: why is Aoilian keeping him alive? And it's as Shaky had expected, the gamekeeper doesn't know. He tries to say that he is being kept alive to have this conversation with Shaky. This makes him important, but his words are as hollow as ever, and Shaky knows that the gamekeeper's state is pitiful. As a last-ditch effort, the gamekeeper tries to share a secret with Shaky, a secret he already knows, that even after being infected and becoming their leader, Aoilian hasn't killed anyone in her life. Shaky puts his head down and then addresses the gamekeeper with finality and tells him to stop with his games, because Shaky stopped being afraid of him the day he left him to die. And then the radio goes silent. When Shaky tries reaching out again, he hears a familiar voice, a voice he has been dying to hear. He hears Aoilian's voice and she says, "Go home, my love." Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 4, Issue number 13, Two Lost in Their Own World. And so begins another one of Shaky's uncounted entries in the journal, and he tells us that the only message Aoilian gave to him was to go home. Her Crossed were watching him, and they would come to Stennis at dusk, so she advised him to go home, and then she never answered any of his pleas or messages. This entry follows the theme of one losing their sense of surroundings when they are too engrossed in something, and we see Shaky writing this entry from his tent back on Carver. Shaky then tells us about the time he spent alone with Teresa again. It was when Reverend White deliberately left them alone after a few drinks under the pretext of getting them another bottle. Shaky and Teresa had a fun time drinking with each other, but none of them cared enough to cherish it because none of them knew that it was their last hour together. We then see what happened a few hours ago. Shaky was too lost while trying to reach Aoilian through the radio, and by the time he realized the time, it was already too late. The Crossed soldiers and the Reverend were gunning for him, and as if that wasn't bad enough, Shaky tripped over a large rock and sprained his ankle. The Reverend had taken this chance to attack him with a pickaxe, and in that moment Shaky had given in and had reminded the Reverend of his orders. Oilian had ordered them all not to hurt Shaky. The Reverend struggled with what he was ordered, and Shaky took this chance to make his escape. We then see how Shaky had orchestrated everything that night. He had gotten Teresa drunk and had sent the kids to play on the lower floors of the bell tower. Once they had privacy, Teresa grew more comfortable with him. We then see Shaky drag his boat on Cava's beach and settle down in his tent where he writes the current journal entry. This is juxtaposed by the intense moment he and Teresa shared while alone in the bell tower, but that is when it hits Shaky in the present time. He scrambles out of his tent and frantically looks around. All the islanders are gone, and Shaky has just noticed this, hours after his arrival on Cava. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 4, Issue number 14, Secluded Keys. And so Shaky starts by numbering his entries once again. This is the 48th entry, and he tells us that he spent that night lamenting his fate, thinking that the islanders had left him for good. He had even shed tears for them, but then, in the morning, they came back with a surprise. They had gone to steal barrels of oil from Flotta, and they had returned with 13 of them. This is juxtaposed by Shaky journaling alone in his tent, while remembering his tender and intimate moments with Teresa in the bell tower while they were drunk. We see Shaky lean in for a kiss back then, and Teresa reciprocates. This moment of togetherness starkly contrasts what is happening with him on Cava. Nobody talks to him, not even the kids, and when Lance slips and tells him the oil is for the Great Escape, Skip quickly takes him away. Shaky then threatens Rab with what will happen now that they've stolen oil. He tries to make him see the truth, but all Rab does is turn to him and tell him that he won't speak to any of the islanders again. Shaky has been disowned, contrasted by Teresa giving in to his needs back in the bell tower and sleeping with him. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 4, Issue number 15, Confessions. What Shaky had warned Rab about happens the next morning. The Reverend and his men come hunting for them because of the stolen barrels, but the Crossed are conflicted due to Oilian's orders. All of this is juxtaposed by scenes of Shaky and Teresa making love to each other. Because the Reverend is conflicted, as a show of defiance and testing his boundaries with Oilian, he orders the Crossed soldiers to kill Maria, and so they do. They then head back to Hoy to see what happens, and the islanders return to doing whatever they're plotting. Then, in the evening, Shaky is approached by Rab, who tells him why the islanders have banished him. It's because Shaky is unlucky and untrustworthy, but most of all, it's because people around him keep dying. Skip and Jamie then ambush Shaky from behind, and this is juxtaposed with Shaky confessing his love to Teresa while he is still inside her. Shaky's ankles get smashed to pieces by Rab, which is juxtaposed with Teresa reciprocating Shaky's love in the past. He is left to rot alone on the island by the islanders, and this is juxtaposed by the memory of Shaky and Teresa confessing their love for each other. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 14, Issue number 16, The Big Fun. It's the 49th entry, and Shaky is journaling at dusk while telling us everything that happens as he lives it. The islanders will leave in the dead of the night, and all of these events contrast Shaky's memories of making love to Teresa. Even back then, she knew that one of her core qualities was her control over her will and her ability to hold back passion, which was confirmed today. Because she knew about the islanders' plan, she allowed them to take the oil because they would be the big fun she had promised her soldiers. All the islanders are free for Crost's taking. As they try to make their escape in the middle of the light, Oilian shoots a flare and lights up the sky. All of her Crossed followers have surrounded the islanders, and what was promised to them will finally be given. This is juxtaposed by Teresa climaxing in the past, as Shaky confesses that even while making love to his beloved at the end of the world, he could not reach the peak. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 4, Issue number 17, Mysteries Are All That's Left. This begins Shaky's last entry in the journal, and we see all the islanders climbing into the oil rigging vessel frantically in an attempt to make their last stand. And Shaky tells us that his and Teresa's last hour came to an end because the Reverend attracted the Crossed on his way back. But see, that was a mystery, for if there were Crossed in the area, they would have spotted him much earlier. He wasn't really that careful, and even if he was spotted on the way way back? Why didn't he close the doors when entering the church? These are just mysteries Shaky would never be able to answer, and all this took place while he was making love to Teresa. Another mystery is why Aurelian kept the gamekeeper around. Why did she overlook everything while he talked to Shaky over the radio? These thoughts are interrupted when Aurelian finally reaches out to Shaky over the radio and he scrambles to answer the call. She has questions and mysteries of her own, and she needs answers. She reminds him of the church where they found the Mother Mary stained glass window with an X. This is juxtaposed by Shaky continuing to make love to Teresa while she simply lies there waiting for him to finish. In the present day, Aurelian asks the answer to her mystery. Did she kill anyone when they held back the cross at that church? Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 4, Issue number 18. The Truth. Shaky is crawling towards the radio as Rab watches on. Shaky is contemplating what he should say, and then remembers the gamekeeper telling him that the Crossed respected her for not killing anyone, and so he tells her the truth, that she never shot a single Crossed back then. These events are juxtaposed again by a disinterested Teresa back at the bell tower, waiting for Shaky to finish. Now it's Shaky's turn to ask a question, and he asks about the gamekeeper. Aurelian tells him that once the envelope plan of turning him into the Crossed failed, she made the gamekeeper talk to him because Shaky would see his facade, see the futility in the gamekeeper's words. She would see him just as she sees him. Shaky would see him as nothing. In the memory, we see Teresa trying to push Shaky off of her because she can hear commotion in the tower below, but Shaky continues and doesn't listen to her. It's Aurelian's turn now, and she asks Shaky if he still loves her. Shaky answers yes instantly, juxtaposed with Teresa getting a fit while Shaky refuses to get off of her back in the bell tower. As Aurelian tells Shaky to ask the next question, we see Rab and the islanders aiming their guns at the Crossed. Shaky poses the final question to Aurelian. What does she really want? Aurelian is surprised by this question because she expected Shaky to know. She wants them both to save each other, like they have been doing all this while, Shaky through his warnings, and Aurelian by controlling the Crossed. We then see Shaky finally climax in the memory as Aurelian foamed from the mouth due to her fit. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 4, Issue number 19, Losing Control. Shaky has now realised that Aurelian is losing control over the Crossed with each passing second. He is frantically searching through the island supplies, but is unable to find the last claymore, and so he decides to enact his plan without it. He sees himself as worthless, and he can't have Aurelian losing control over the Crossed for him, nor can he let the islanders make a last stand and die at the hands of the Reverend and his fanatic followers. And so Shaky makes his last heroic stand. He tells Aurelian that he loves her, but she needs to be strong and needs to establish her dominance once again. She needs to let go of him. She needs to let the Crossed take Shaky. When she refuses, Shaky gets in a boat and crashes it, and himself on the rocks in the Scapa Flow as the ultimate sacrifice. He has gotten the Reverend and the Crossed's attention, and Rab uses this chance to tell the islanders to get ready to escape. But then Shaky reveals that he is just repenting for what he had done back in the church. He hadn't cared for Aurelian and her fit back in the bell tower, even when Reverend White had tried to stop him. He had simply knocked him out and had continued to make love to Teresa while she was suffering from a fit in an attempt to climax. This was his way of redeeming himself. Crossed Wish You Were Here, Volume 4, Issue number 20, Old Dog New Tricks. Shaky and Aurelian both failed to realise that the Crossed Reverend White had been listening to their conversation all this while. And when Shaky had finally convinced Aurelian to give up his life and offer him to the Crossed, he had done what he had learned from her all those months back in the north. He had told the Crossed to wait, and they had listened to him. The Reverend had then stabbed Aurelian in the collarbone and left her adrift on her own special boat. He had then shown the Crossed what really mattered. They needed to hunt down the islanders before they escaped, because they could always return for Shaky the next day. And this moment makes Shaky solve yet another mystery. It wasn't the Reverend that led the Crossed to the bell tower. No, it was the sound of him finally climaxing that drew their attention. By the time he was done, it was already too late. He could hear the screams of the children from the tower below, and Teresa was incapacitated due to the fit, and Reverend White was knocked out. As the Crossed approached the oil rig to attack the islanders, and Shaky watched Aurelian's boat drift away into the sea, he realised that his orchestrated redemption had once again slipped out of his hands. Crossed, Wish You Were Here, Volume 4, Issue number 21, Deserving Redemptions in a Fair World. Shaky's attempt at an orchestrated redemption had failed again because he had also tried the same thing at the bell tower. He had faced the Crossed in the lower floors alone to redeem himself of his heinous actions. At first, he thought he had taken care of everyone, but then he realized that 3 of the children were missing, and this memory is juxtaposed by the Crossed boarding the oil rigging vessel as Shaky lies on the rocks, dejectedly. Back at the bell tower, Shaky had spotted the blood trail leading upstairs where Teresa and the Reverend were, and that was when he knew he had failed them both. In the present day, however, when the Reverend breaches the deck and heads inside expecting to ambush the islanders, he instead finds Celine. She is alone, smiling and holding the claymore Shaky was searching for in her hands. She blows up the vessel, the Reverend, and all his disciples. Celine got her redemption maybe because she deserved it more than Shaky. Crossed, Wish You Were Here, Volume 4, Issue number 22, People That Return. Shaky watches the oil rig burn down and kill all of Aurelian and Reverend's disciples in the process. This is juxtaposed by Shaky standing outside the bell tower trap door while he listens to Aurelian's body being chomped upon by the toddlers. He did everything in his power to will himself to open the door and face the consequences, but he had no bullets. And as Shaky struggles with his cowardice in the memory, we see Rab and the islanders escaping in their boats. Rab can still see Shaky from the thermal scope. He could go back and get him and start from scratch once again, but he doesn't. Just like Shaky didn't open the trap door back then and go back to save Teresa. Shaky, Rab and the islanders might have been cut from the same cloth, but Aurelian is different even after being infected, because after being left stranded by Rab, Shaky watches a boat approaching him in the morning and Aurelian is driving it. Crossed, Wish You Were Here, Volume 4, Issue number 23, the much-awaited reunion. And so, as Aurelian struggles with her injury, Shaky asks her to take a seat because she has plenty of time. He hands her his journal and tells her that it's his story and it's about her. She flips through the pages, and Shaky keeps writing her new ones. All of these panels are juxtaposed with the past where the toddlers were feasting upon Aurelian's flesh. Once Aurelian is done flipping through the pages, she takes the new ones Shaky is writing, reads them and throws them to the wind. Shaky doesn't look up at her and she can't take her eyes off him. Shaky is pouring out all his hatred for himself in the most vile possible words in these new pages, and this is clearly his way of reaching a cathartic end. But then Shaky stops when he finally looks at her, looks at what she has been doing to the new pages, and looks at all the blood she has lost. And that is when Aurelian reveals that she has been doing all this to achieve a perfect end to her story, a perfect end to Shaky's story, a perfect end to their story as a couple. She hands him the only weapon she has, the flare gun, and then tells him that she can't find the perfect ending to their story. Shaky must. And Shaky once again falls in love with her all over again, because he too has been trying to find the perfect end to his story, satisfying his innate need to find meaning as a writer. And so he pens down the perfect ending that he can think of, and this is juxtaposed by an infected Teresa finally waking up from her fit and killing the child as Shaky leaves the church. But then Aurelian reveals another truth. She wants him to give them a perfect end in life and not on paper. She hasn't read a single word he has written. She can't because she is crossed. All she has been doing is counting the number of words on each page. Shaky begins to cry and Aurelian stands up and tells Shaky to stop crying. She says, "No more words. Be the judge, my love. Punishments and rewards, your mess, your responsibility, your duty. Give us all an end." Crossed, Wish You Were Here, Volume 4, Issue number 24, The Unseen End. And so the last comic is from Rab's perspective as he keeps an eye on Shaky and Aurelian. We never see the two star-crossed lovers, only the islanders as they watch from the shore. Rab is watching them through the binoculars while being hounded by the children for answers. But Rab can't tell them everything because what Shaky and Aurelian are doing is too graphic for the children. But we learn that Aurelian hadn't returned to the rocks alone. Her boat had the incapacitated gamekeeper in it, and the two of them spent the entire morning torturing the gamekeeper and then finally ended his life by shooting the flare gun in his mouth. As the gamekeeper burned to a crisp, they threw him in the boat and let it drift away. They didn't want to leave the rocks. They wanted the end on their own terms. Then came the loud moans, and Rab didn't tell the children, but the rest of the islanders already knew. After hours of lovemaking, and once Shaky was turned, the two held hands, looked at each other, and voluntarily plunged themselves into the Scarpa flow. That's the end of their story. and we see the islanders set out on foot in search of a new safe haven. All that remains of Carver are Jamie, Miranda, Lance, Skip, Rab, Roshan, and Chanice. The rest were lost so that these few could walk.